Hi, everyone. We are very happy to welcome you to this webinar that is organized by different associations, European and African, because we're active on both continents. My name is Cécile van der Sapen. I've worked for CNCD in France, but based in Belgium, in Brussels, and we co-organized this webinar with associations that are based in Belgium, like ELF, CNCD France, the CI. Also, we have a French association like Cimade, Italian like ARCI, Spanish like Aline. We are also happy to organize this webinar with associations from Senegal, which is called the REMIDEV. We also organize this webinar with networks which are active on both continents. We have Human Rights, Migreurop and Emmaus. There are many people registered for this webinar. You are more than 300 people interested to understand a bit more this European Pact on Migration and Asylum, and also interested in having a critical analysis that will have a good overview from North and South and what this pact contains. We have decided to organize this webinar now for 3 reasons, because there are 3 important elements that needs to be highlighted. The first one is the French presidency of the European institutions that started in January and that will end up in June. And the French president highlighted the fact that he wants to accelerate the introduction of this pact. And this pact was presented in 2020, so it's been 2 years now, but for the time being, the implementation is quite slow. So we felt that it was important to organize this webinar now. Another important moment is the EU-Africa summit that just happened. It was on the 17th and 18th of February. So this Europe-African summit announced a new type of partnership between the 2 continents. And we thought it was important to organize this webinar following this summit. So the answers brought by the summits are quite limited, we have to say, and we need to include civil societies on both continents. And the orientation given to the on the control of borders, the fight against human trafficking, and they want to accelerate the expulsions, returns, and there is a very few spaces given to the different mechanisms of migration that are very important on the African side. So the questions on migrations have been mentioned in the EU-Africa summit. And there is also always that problem of what we call a chosen immigration. And it is not something that is acceptable for us, especially when we talk about justice in migration. The third point is that we have an internal agenda, and we had a good study on the European Pact. This study can be downloaded on the CNCD website, so you can access this, and we can also organize we can send it to you. So you can go, please, to the CNCD webpage, and you click on the Migration Pact link, and you will have access to documents. We will also create a podcast soon that have been organized with co-organizations. The objective of this webinar is to give you a critical analysis of this pact, thanks to the different speakers, and also to offer alternatives and offer solutions and not to be locked in this situation and that negative vision of a partnership. I will tell you briefly how this webinar will be organized. So we will be together for 4 hours. There will be a break in the middle of the webinar, but we will start with an overview of EuromedRights, of the content of the pact. So what is the pact offering? What this pact wants to put in place? How is it articulated to solve the problems of migrations? We will then see with different speakers the impact on Sahel and also on Maghreb region of the different measures that will be described in the pact. So we will have people and different speakers talking on their countries and their point of views. We will also have a look at the different negotiations of that political pact, where we are at the moment. I mentioned this morning that it was presented in the Commission in 2020. We are now in February 2022. So where are the negotiations now? Are there some blockage? Will the pact be signed during the French presidency? So all those questions will be discussed. How the negotiations will be articulated at the council level, at the parliament level. We will have Saskia Briscoe, who is a European deputy, who will tell us. She belongs to the Greens in parliament. We will then have Madame Jacot, who will speak, who is a representation of Belgium to EU for the council. And then we will have a video because unfortunately, Madame Diaye could not join us today. We have a video of Madame Yundan explaining us what the situation is and what the vision is for the African Union and about this pact. We want also to think of alternative solutions about European migrations. And we have two speakers, Flore Didden from 1111 from Belgium, who will talk about migration and justice in migration. And we will also have another speaker from Italy, and she will tell us about an agenda that we are suggesting in terms of coordination and mobilization, joint mobilization, to try to influence the content of the pact as civil society. We will also have some time for debate and questions, so time dedicated for question and answers. But we invite you to ask questions now in the chat. My colleague Lydie will collect all those questions. So I'm concluding now. So please ask your question in the chat. Until 12:30, we will take all those questions and we will sort them according to the different topics, and we will try to answer those questions. And if we have some time left, we will see if we can give the floor to the participants if there are some questions. I will now talk about technical aspects. It is very important for the translators. You have to mute your mic and cut your video for the quality of transmission, and also to avoid background noise. Ask your question in the chat. We remind you that there is translation in French and in English. You just have to choose the language that you prefer at the bottom of your screen. And we have to tell you also that this webinar is recorded, which means that you will be able to listen to this again and access for the public. Before giving the floor to the first speaker, Sarah Prestiani of EuromedRights, I would like to have a special thought for Ukrainian people and for all the events that are happening at the moment and the news that we've received this morning. So I think it's a personal thought, but I want to have a very special thought for the Ukrainian people. Sarah, you've got the floor. Sarah Prestiani is head of the thematic program unit, Migration and Asylum, Women's Rights and Gender Justice, and Economic and Social Rights at EuromedRights. Thank you very much, Cécile, for giving me the floor and also to express solidarity. I think it was very important. So I will give a small analysis of this pact that was presented by the European Commission in September 2020. So it is called a pact, but it has different elements. So I wanted to come back to the political origins of this pact, and I think we need to analyze the different regions. So we come back to 2015, which is the year where we had an instrumentalization of the figures of migrants who arrived on the European territories. 1 million migrants were compared to an invasion. And it created a shift in terms of European policies for migration, and they wanted to strengthen borders and increase security to avoid having people coming to the European territory. So that's the basis. And the implementation of hotspot systems at the Italian border and the Greek border. So we'll see a bit later on what the pact will do, but it will strengthen those hotspots. But this was already present in the hotspot policies put in place in 2015. In 2016, European Commission started a reform of asylum with the attempt to reform the Dublin scheme. And this is what created situations where people were blocked and thousands of asylum claims could not be proceeded. So European Parliament worked on different propositions, and they tried to overcome those limits and those issues of the responsibility of the country of first arrival. But unfortunately, at the council level, at the state member levels, these propositions failed. So the origin of the pact lies on a complete failure of negotiations of the reform of the migration systems that dates back from 2016. There is a problem with security also, and they want to justify all those elements through security. So these are the basics, and this is the background of the pact that was presented in 2020. 5 legislative proposals about different areas: asylum, migration, borders, 3 recommendations, and 1 document about the directive. So this is the background, and this is the package of the European Pact. And it carries out reforms in the procedures when you enter Europe and the external borders, a mechanism of responsibilities and the state solidarity. So this is a funny word because I will tell you later on that it is absolutely not solidarity, but it is a mechanism to deal with crisis situations, new procedures that will be accelerated for asylum. And Mrs. Skinas, the commissioner, described the first layers of the pact. I won't go into details because the next presentation will go a bit deeper, but I will tell you more an analysis of the possible consequences on the ground of those proposals, but also an analysis that is a bit more political of the proposal of the European Commission. The first element that I want to highlight is that the European Commission suggested this package of 700 pages there were legislative proposals and recommendations without doing what we do, an impact study. This should have been done, and the European Commission has to do something similar every time they are doing legislative proposals. And here there is a complete absence of impact study. So it is interesting to see how the European countries are supposed to make proposals, and they ask pan-European agencies to do proposals, and there were very strong critics. And it is an official document from the Center Research of Pan-European. So it is a very critical vision of this pact, and also from the civil society, but also for the different studies that have been carried out, and they are quite critical of this pact. Generally speaking, some proposals are very confused, and they are absolutely non-applicable if you have a look at what is applied in terms of asylum, inefficient also to handle the question of answering the challenges. So this pact has been criticized from everywhere, and very few positive proposals, and it is a failure, and it is a violation of the fundamental rights of the people. Let's look a bit into details what the dimensions are, and also the different elements of analysis that we've done. As I said, the first dimension is an external dimension, and it is characterized by conditions. So what do I mean by that? It's how do we organize the returns when a third country is accepting migrants, expulsed from European countries. What are the conditions? Would be like positive or negatives in terms of delivering and issuing visas? So you can see that this logical has been put in place by the French government, and they announced the reduction of 50% of visas for Maghreb countries. And it is an element that is interesting in the pact. And you can see that some proposals are already implemented by some member states, even if the pact is not adopted yet. This logic, which is quite dangerous, because the safe and legal routes to territories that would be able to reduce dead people at the borders, because a lot of migrants are taking risks. Of course, if there is no legal routes, people are ready, to take considerable risks on the sea, or even through different countries. So if you don't have legal routes to access the territories, then you don't solve the problem of people taking huge risks. So there is no positive impact on that. The external dimension, and I invite you to create a link with the European budgets that are allocated for the externalization. And it goes into what we call the conditionality. And today, for a budget 2021-2027, it's a budget of over 9 billion euros. So the external dimension of the pact is linked to the allocation of the European budget. And today, it is the most important budget for Europe. The second part is the management of what we call the triage, so sorting people who are at the border. So they want to apply those triage at the external borders. It's the screening process. So first of all, there is a legal problem, because you cannot make a distinction between people of you can enter and you cannot enter. So it's like extra territories. It is the model that is reproduced on the borders of the EU. The idea is that migrants who arrive in Europe will have to stay for 5 days in those places. So those places, those locations are outside the European borders, and there is a concept of extraterritorials. And within those 5 days, you've got procedures of screening, identification, and they make a screening of people, those who can be straight sent into a return process. It is a concept that it's being sent to some safe countries. So this is a concept that we do not accept, because you cannot assess, you have to assess the situation of a person, but not the situation of a country. And also the second option is to send the person to an accelerate process of asylum claim. In this process, these people will be sorted whether they have some chances of getting asylum claim approved or not.
So firstly, I think something important to say on this is that the return process and this accelerated asylum process is very important to look at. It's very difficult, in fact, to make this work. And I think in terms of detention, there are also many issues for people who were actually destined or designed to be going through a return process. There are detention centres, and there's ambiguity around the route towards accelerated asylum. So people are finding themselves practically detained. We've seen what has happened on the Greek islands. We've also seen what happened at the beginning of what we call the Canaries crisis, with the transfers being blocked. So this detention logic is something that the EU is actually kind of playing on when it comes to the ambiguity surrounding it, and this is very problematic. The European Commission hasn't really put things in place to make this clear and to actually do an impact study on the current situation. We've found some very worrying figures surrounding this. So if we look at the case of Italy, the arrivals in 2020 were very considerable when it came to the number of people arriving on European territory, and out of the total number, a high percentage were actually trying to be pushed through this accelerated asylum process. And it was important, therefore, to look at the unrealistic scenario with around about 14,500 people being in a state of detention at the same time. So we can look at the highest figures, which reached almost 16,000 people. So how can we think about this as something feasible within the Italian context? In Spain, there are around about 7,000 places in these detention centres, but I think the figures have reached something like 20,000 at times. So there's a real issue of vulnerability here, and the conditions in which migrants are finding themselves when they arrive. We can look at the migrants who have arrived from Libya, who have been victims of torture, and the way in which their situations have not been properly taken into account with the service provision available. I'm now going to move into this third part of my presentation, thinking about this concept of so-called solidarity. So there are principles surrounding relocation, the idea of actually having arrivals received in other European countries. The idea is to obviously ease the burden on some of the frontline countries, such as Italy and Greece. And there's the sponsorship return criteria as well. So for the first entry country, the idea is that there's a certain sharing of the procedures when it comes to responsibilities and the passage from one country to another. There's another option here we need to talk about when it comes to paying for the to receive migrants to ease this burden on frontline countries. I think there are very worrying elements surrounding this when it comes to the various possibilities. We've seen in Greece some of the figures reaching around 4,000 people in detention, for example, and the proposals, as I said at the beginning of this talk, are unclear, they're confusing, they're not realistic, and they don't really comply with the necessities that we've actually seen when it comes to services that refugees and asylum seekers absolutely need. I don't think that the measures really consider solutions to reduce the number of individuals who are finding themselves in unacceptable conditions when they are trying to enter a given country. There are real violations of human rights going on European borders. The reduction of asylum spaces or asylum places in general is also very worrying. So there is a lack of consideration for some of the key elements that need to be considered when it comes to safe and legal routes, or when it comes to harmonizing asylum policy, to really consider the founding principles of the Geneva Convention signed by member states. We need to absolutely underline the fact that this is being undermined at the moment. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry if I ran over slightly. Thank you very much, Sarah, to you. And six of these conventions are particularly, five conventions are particularly important here when it comes to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, also the European Convention on Fundamental Liberties. This is specifically human rights related. Also, more general conventions from a legal point of view internationally, the Geneva Convention on Refugees, and also the International Pact on the UN Convention Against Torture. So there is a series of points in the pact that need to be looked at in relation to the conventions from a legal point of view. I think it's important to look at 6 fundamental categories of rights that are not taken into account correctly in the pact. So this is linked again to some of the security and protection issues at stake, and the internal and external borders. So if we look at these categories of rights, they are not exhaustive, but they're very important when it comes from an asylum and movement point of view, freedom of movement. So we have to look at the right to recourse, the procedural guarantee, the family reunification rights as well. So in terms of also the way in which data is stored and collected, so data protection rights, undermined by the pact. We talked also about vulnerabilities that are not necessarily taken into account as part of the pact, and also risks of discrimination, particularly racial discrimination. With regard to the right to asylum and also the issue of pushbacks, this pact has a series of quite problematic points in terms of triage. So we need to look at how individuals are actually sorted in terms of return procedures, and also how in the asylum procedures are being looked at when it comes to these express and ordinary procedures. So these are some of the issues surrounding the question of nationality. And we have to look, therefore, at the concept of a safe third country, and also the consideration of express asylum procedures that can sometimes be applied automatically to certain nationals. This needs to be therefore looked at in terms of the figures at stake and the way in which the pact is being applied. So we are really looking at the idea of objective and subjective criteria. Where does the pact come in when it comes to individual personal cases, specific situations, etc., particularly with regard to nationality? Do we have a blanket procedure or decision just based on nationality? There is also a crisis mechanism that looks at suspending some of the principles linked to actually respecting these conventions. So how can we actually analyze this from the point of view of a potential threat? There's also the issue of pushbacks, as I mentioned, so expulsions and refugees on borders. How are the situations respected, particularly the APR positioning within the pact? There's a certain limit placed on movements when people are actually going through appeals procedures, and there are some important issues linked to the fact that sometimes individuals are not allowed to remain in the territory where they are. So there are very problematic points here being brought in when it comes to holding individuals when they're in this state of limbo. So how do we look at the filtering procedures that are being put in place, and the extra legal spaces that are actually part of this EU context? Individuals are being detained de facto at the doors of Europe because they're unable to actually go through this filtering process in the right way to actually respect their freedoms. So we feel that there are violations of international rights going on here, and we really need to look at how the provisions set out in the pact undermine some of the principles set out in key conventions. So how do we look at preparation for return to people's home countries? Some of the problematic issues surrounding this is the fact that exceptional provisions are being made legal, and these exceptional provisions are sometimes not necessarily being applied only in exceptional cases. So how do we actually define this? How do we guarantee true legal security for individuals in this situation? There's no mention of access to legal advice in certain circumstances, the information being given to individuals, where is this coming from, who is responsible for informing individuals during the filtering procedures, also how are the conventions being applied. We could look at the Article 7 particularly with regard to this. We don't have much of an idea of the authorities responsible for actually guaranteeing these points. Can individuals in this context have the right to appeal? This is still rather ambiguous. And how would they do this? There's only one degree of appeal at the moment when it comes to these procedures, and I think it's important to actually look at how this appeal possibility is being organised. There are real limits here, I feel, when it comes to guarantees. Guarantees are not very present, let's say, in this pact as it is at the moment. We have to also look at family and the right to a private life, privacy. There are some real problems surrounding this when it comes to the fact that the filtering procedures often undermine some of the rights that families should be guaranteed, particularly when it comes to their their aims, the control procedure in terms of irregular immigration, also collecting and storing information on individuals. We have to look at the rights issues surrounding this. How is protection and internal security being taken into account when it comes to visa procedures and when it comes to other very problematic positions on data collection? There is an issue surrounding minors as well. In terms of data collection, there are some restrictions that come in up to the age of 14, some up to the age of 16. So how are these rights being guaranteed? I think Sarah already talked about the fact that the pact doesn't take into account vulnerability. It doesn't define the categories of individuals that could be considered to be in a vulnerable situation. And we need further qualification of this. And this needs to be, I think, strengthened. Individuals with disabilities, for example, pregnant women, individuals who have been victims of sexual violence or gender-based violence, victims of torture as well. So it's important to look at how these elements are taken into account. I think it's a really key issue when it comes to return procedures also. There are some problems surrounding the crisis mechanism being brought in when it comes to the examination of procedures within this area. So we see people being detained for longer than they should be. We see that there isn't necessarily a taking into account of the fundamental rights regarding detention. The pact also has some real gaps surrounding the right to non-discrimination. So how are we going to be able to ensure that individuals being checked on the external borders have these rights respected? There are some issues surrounding checks. Also, there are no guidelines and controls taking place when it comes to the checks that are being carried out. So we need to look at discrimination based on physical characteristics, racial discrimination, and how this is being regulated. It's very important also to see that there is a real mix of some contradictory aims in the pact, actually creating a climate of trust and confidence within member states is a problematic issue. Therefore, there's a climate of mistrust, I would say, that is being fostered here. And when we see the way in which entry routes and borders are being effectively policed, it's important, therefore, to really underline the fundamental rights that are in question here when it comes to the rollout of this pact and new policies, and how there may be a real insistence on certain points. Thank you very much.
Tu as pu calmement exposer ton intervention. Nous allons maintenant passer en fait à un autre volet, une fois qu'on a posé le cadre, en tout cas du pacte européen Asile et Migration grâce à Sarah et Alice. Nous allons passer maintenant à l'impact et aux conséquences encore des mesures au niveau du Sahel, spécifiquement du Sénégal et également du Maghreb. Je passe, il y a de nouveau un petit changement dans le programme, je passe la parole directement à Monsieur Senghor, qui travaille à la RADO. Monsieur Senghor est chargé des affaires juridiques et de la protection à l'association RADO, qui est basée au Sénégal, et il va nous expliquer quelles sont les conséquences au niveau de la population sénégalaise, notamment au niveau de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, si ce pacte était réellement mis en œuvre.
Are reminded, most of the time we need to talk about some definitions, because today migration is seen differently, and I think today migration is linked to the history of humanity, and it implies many countries throughout the continent. So a migrant is a person who is leaving his place of residence to reach another country and is traveling beyond the national borders. These moves are either forced or volunteers, and those movements are sometimes used for refugees and asylum seekers. And this creates problems in terms of security on the national and international level. This is why at the beginning of the century, the European Union defined a migration policy that was organized around 3 pillars. The first one was a clear definition of its migration policy. The second was an externalized control of its borders, and the implementation of a supporting process. And I think the European Union always stayed in the same logic, and they are still negotiating the different points. The discourse of Madame von der Leyen of September 2021 highlights that the policy of exclusion of migrants will keep going on, and that migrants are not welcome. They will be dealt with outside the borders of the European borders. And they will deport migrants. It is important to say that freedom of movement is the basic of human rights. We can also try to name some of the reasons that led us to this situation, to try to understand why we're in such a situation. We can talk about resources, the lack of resources, stealing resources. Many problems started in the region with some fishermen and water supplies. And a lot of resources have been stolen from them, which had a huge impact on their business. I've chosen to tell you about two important points. The first one is the impact of the migration policies on the human rights, to demonstrate that there are bad effects that are explicit and implicit. The application of the migration policies on Senegal have a huge impact on our country, trying to deter many people to travel to Europe. Some people see their rights violated. The population, when we talk about immigration, a lot of people try to look for new routes, and they tend to take illegal routes, which means that you have smugglers that take advantage of those people, and they can organize trips in horrible conditions and dangerous conditions for the population. And there are a lot of abuses. The European Union is trying to implement policies and projects to sanction and criminalize migrants. It is important to explain that there was a study that was carried out a few months ago. There were money dedicated in Senegal to try to solve the problem. And money is managed by the state. And they do not reach the vulnerable people. And the European Union is trying to develop policies that are carried out by Frontex, the European agency to look after the borders, that is dedicated huge amounts of money to secure the borders. Following a meeting with an agency, with the representative of 26 states here in Dakar, in Senegal, some stakeholders revealed at the end of the meeting that they were very concerned. They said that Frontex tripled since 2015 the budget and the figures. The agencies got 20 to 25 boats, and they have 1,500 agents working for Europe. So it shows that Europe stays in the logic of protecting the borders and military aspect. The first problem is that there is no visibility on the future. Secondly, I was concerned about the respect of human rights. Many people die in sea. I expressed my concern, but I appear to be the only one concerned by all those tragedies. When we talk about transparency, I didn't get any response either. The second effect of those policies is that in some countries, citizens have been arrested for having just their right of movements. They had their passport confiscated, and migrants have been accused of being smugglers by the European Union, and they end up being arrested, which is very frustrating because in Western Africa, if we are in that situation, we have to understand that the European Union is partly responsible of those problems because of its policies. Because people cannot apply their rights. So these were the exclusive effects. Next to those effects, there are some implicit effects. The European policies has some huge consequences. And there are some negative effects that are produced by those policies. The financial impact also is huge. And we don't know about that impact. It's not well known. A lot of families are leaving. And they are poor because they spend their economy, their savings to try to move to Europe. So we have to understand that those savings are very important for the families and that they're spending their savings on their trips. So this has a huge impact also, financial impact on families. And some human groups are exploited. And people are crossing territories that are extremely dangerous, like Libya. So I don't see the positive effects of the policies. There are also some rights that are violated in African countries. And by externalizing the violations of human rights, Europe is remaining silent because they are violating people's rights. The US, for example, the USA exported the violations of human rights to Guantanamo camp and prison. This is something that is well known. And Europe is doing the same at its borders. So that was my first point. Second point. Just, Mr. Sanga, to let you know that you have 7 minutes left. Just to let you know that we cannot see you because you didn't turn your camera on. So we cannot see your face, but I can't see my camera, so sorry about that. So I'll turn it on. So on the second point of the impact of this policy, we will see the impact on refugees and the relevant groups. So there are some direct impacts on the refugees and other groups. What I mean in other groups is the asylum seekers. People who are leaving their home countries for persecutions and violence have to be welcomed, and they are considered as refugees. They can claim asylum, and countries need to show international solidarity. But that legal route that is clearly stated in the convention is not here and cannot be implemented alongside the European policies in terms of migration. Because Europe should be protecting those groups and those vulnerable people. But in reality, asylum claims are restricted and family unity is questioned. The statistic given by Madame van der Leyen on the European Pact are, and I quote, "We need to respond to the humanitarian issues that is happening at our borders. We estimate," so I'm still quoting her, 100 million people, displaced people in the world, and about 30 million refugees and asylum seekers. Vast majority of them are welcome in developing countries. It is clear that they want to keep those people outside of Europe. There are also what we call indirect impacts, because the European Union is weakening on purpose some agencies of the UN. And when we talk about the Convention of 1951, some action is taken by the UN and weakened by the European Union. On the ground, we can confirm that there is difficult communication between ACL and the refugees in Senegal. Usually they come from countries from like Rwanda, Central Africa. And we try to transfer the claims towards European Union. Those people are vulnerable and they've been rejected by the other states. Those families are deprived of the policy of family unity. And with the publication of these policies and the principle of non-refoulement to guarantee the right of asylum is violated. To conclude, and I will finish here, for the UN, the African population is going to be 11.18 billion, and the population is continuously increasing. which is going to represent 39% of the world population. And when we talk about the active population, this population, sub-Saharan population, is increasing by 70% each year. So these are the figures that were published a few months ago. Here in Senegal. Africa is the continent of the future, but we need to guarantee movement and mobilities between south and north. And this creates tensions. I think if Europe wants to solve the problems with the south, they need to rethink their policies. And I will finish with this. Leave is traveling. So if you want to leave, you have to accept travels. And this is how I want to conclude my speech. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Sangor. Thank you very much for your intervention. I will now give the floor to Mr. Aziz Chechou, who is the president of the Association Jeunesse Nigérienne au Service du Développement, which is member of different networks of the EI and APS, and they will give you more information about that network. But he is coordinator of Alarm Phone Sahara, and he's based in Nigeria. You've got the floor, Mr. Chechou, and I hope that you will be able to turn your camera on. Thank you very much, Cécile. Hi, everyone.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today in the name of my organisation. We are brought together here to look together at the Pact, and I'm going to speak as the president of the Nigerian Youth to Serve Development, Sustainable Development. We are a member of various international networks, and I'm a founding president. We also would like to look at our transnational network, Alarm Phone Sahara. Just a second, we're just going to ask our other colleague to please turn off his microphone. There's some sound bleeding in. Thank you very much for that. So just to continue, our national situation means that we're very much part of this this network, the Alarm Phone network in various different African countries. It's a project that is being organised, and the idea is to participate as an AP member. So it's a network that we're able to actually participate in, and we're able now to actually establish contact with our other European members of the network. So it's a real honour for us to be here today with you to talk specifically about human rights in the Sahel area and the impact of the EU Pact on this level, particularly within our local area. For our presentation, we are going to look at the Pact in a more general sense, and then the migratory policy in Africa to see where the Pact comes in here. We're going to also look at our positioning vis-a-vis this Pact, and try to draw some conclusions from this. The speakers this morning have already presented various elements of the content of the European Pact on migration and asylum. it's important to say that the issue of migration linked to the migratory crisis is very much a topical one for us in our country. We hear a lot of people talking about various elements relating to the application of European immigratory policies in Africa, and this is very important for us within the Sahel region. We therefore can have a look at the migratory policy in Africa as well, and try to actually establish links between this and the pact itself, and look at what the impacts are here when it comes to the populations of the Sahel region. So for the first part of my presentation today, I'm going to speak briefly about the European Pact itself. It came in after the failure of the negotiations and was presented by the European Commission in September 2020. It's a project to reform European migratory policy and what was set up before the 2015 crisis. And we have to obviously look at this in the context of the COVID pandemic and the recovery plans that are now being rolled out. There are a number of proposals now that are looking to be phased in. There are filtering and screening procedures that are in the pipeline. The context for managing migration is going to be altered, particularly with elements basis to crisis situation and force majeure. We can also look at points related to asylum, and we could perhaps categorize three main directions or aims, particularly linked to solidarity, reinforcing cooperation with third countries, securing borders. 5 years after the 2015 crisis, therefore, we have this new series of proposals on the table linked to the various ways in which European external borders are going to be regulated. And there are some important impacts linked to the increased controls taking place on external borders. It's important, therefore, to look at some of the provisions and the way in which they will impact upon the Sahel region. This moves to my second part of the presentation today, migratory policy in Africa. So we can look at what the situation was in 2015 and how migratory policy was organised. There were various programs that were brought in surrounding, for example, sustainable development, with links to the European Union and various different regulatory frameworks and conventions that were actually brought out around about the 2014-2016 period. So we've seen the principles of solidarity, shared responsibility and partnerships coming into play. The idea is that we are being encouraged to manage migratory flows together and look at cooperation between different countries and states, particularly through certain legal commitments. It's important to think about the engagement or the commitments linked to La Valette, so the various existing instruments in place, the alliance with the European Union to really fight against instability and some of the root causes of displacement. So there are various important foundations set up when it comes to our joint action plan and declarations that have been made. There were meetings organised also around about 2017 between various representatives of different countries in the context of this framework and promise to actually work together on this cooperation. So what is the situation on the ground? We found that repressive measures were actually being introduced, and that actually there was almost a change overnight when it came to migratory policy being actually imposed upon certain African countries. There were strong reactions from certain quarters in our region. Certain analysts looked at the situation, and now we have the pact. 5 years after the 2015 crisis, we need to look at the way in which European countries are looking at asylum claims and the things that are potentially going to change when it comes to individuals arriving in Europe. There are quite a few controversial points surrounding these new proposals, and it's interesting to see what the reactions are from European citizens. We have looked at the lack of structure and clarity with regard to certain provisions, and the fact that we could perhaps characterize the pact as a certain compromise. We need to look at what certain ONGs are saying. Oxfam, for example, is accusing the Commission of some quite strong violations. We feel that there are certain aspects that really are problematic from a point of view of human rights. We have various preoccupations and concerns being voiced also by analysts here locally. There are also alarm signals being rung by Caritas Europa when it comes to the guarantees available for immigrants. It's important, therefore, to look at the content of the proposals being made by the European Commission and to try to really weigh these up in terms of the significant impacts that they could have outside of the European continent. I think the position being taken at the moment shows that this pact is just a second, excuse me, I have a few technical issues, I think. So this positioning now is very problematic when it comes to actually setting out clear cooperation with African partners on migratory issues. There's a CTS specialized committee working on the issue of migration and displaced individuals, and we have now various situations being analysed when it comes to African migrants actually arriving in Europe. We're examining some of the driving forces behind migratory flows, and looking at the issue of contemporary slavery in particular. So the issue of illegal immigration is something that obviously is being very much looked at by the Pact, but we have to look at the notion of passage, safe, legal passage. How can we actually ensure that people have proper routes, that the stability of African communities is taken into account? How are the filtering possibilities going to affect African nationals on the move? It's important to also consider the issues at stake linked to some of the migratory flows from north to south, some of the repressive movements that we've seen being set up, and the ideas surrounding irregular immigration or illegal immigration, and some of the measures being taken now with regard to transports, policing, etc. To conclude, I think I would say that although certain African states are now voicing their opposition to the pact, we need to continue our analysis, particularly within the Sahel area, and really try to work to underline the real root causes of some of the migratory situations we see. We have to look at the fragile situations that people are facing and the support that we need to actually try to set up the best possible conditions for individuals in cooperative environments. Sharing responsibility is a real issue. We need to look not only as at purchasing power and relationships between different individuals in positions of power, but also how migratory flows can be best managed, and how these individuals who are in a situation of displacement can be supported. We need to make sure, therefore, that the issue of governments and responsibility is really at the forefront of our minds, and we need to look at the pact as something that needs to be seriously examined both within the European Union and also within different African countries and the Sahel region in particular, in the context of our challenges that we're facing at the moment. I'd like to continue our collaboration, and I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you very much for your presentation today. I think we're going to move straight on because of the time we lost with the technical issues. So I'm going to pass straight on to Mr. Sami Adwani. He is a member of the FTDES Managing Committee, and he is an economist by trade. I'd like to therefore pass you the floor, Mr. Adwani. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to take the floor today to give you an idea of the context that we are actually experiencing at the moment, analysing the pact quite quickly, and also looking at the Maghreb countries on the whole, on an overall level, and also country by country, it's important to look at this problematic situation that we're facing at the moment, particularly in the context of the Mediterranean crossings, in the desert zones, and at the frontiers of our various countries. It's important to think about good governance, listening to each other, and trying to actually collaborate in a positive way. As you know, the situation of migrants is really degrading in all of our countries. Human mobility is very much on the agenda, and migrants are becoming a political object, a political football, if you like. If we look at the pact from this perspective, we could see it as the logical result of recent policy. We've seen some of the trends that have been characterizing European countries of late, and the populist positioning of particularly the right-wing parties in several countries. There are some real issues that are being brushed under the carpet in this context. Rights violations are becoming systematic. They're being formalized through regulation. There is an arbitrary practice context now, and we have a situation whereby practices that were once illegal are being legalized.
It is a consequence of the treatment of migration by administration that deal with the Home Office. So there is a logical of returns and repression instead of a human treatment. Interdependencies of our regions is dedicated in the Pact and talk about cooperation of the South to slow down the arrival in Europe and avoid saturation of the detention centers. The European Commission is trying to externalize the borders, having agreements with countries in transit with lack of dialogue and transparency. In that context, we realized that Europe is deciding what's happening in terms of migration for all the neighboring countries, determining a policies of non-reception, and opens the door of an instrumentalization of the migration issue. There is no responsibility for the population living in the countries in the Maghreb region. The states of the regions are acting as if the presence of migrants was only for the short term. They are reducing access to rights. Instead of living together policies, the state of the region just live with the issue. We are dependent of the administration and the policies. All the societies of the Mediterranean region in which the foreign population live are excluded, and those people are the target of repression. The first response is the control of the flux transiting throughout our countries, and the states are developing policies of non-reception, which are echoing the EU policies. There is a regression that is observed on two sides of the Mediterranean, and it will be now managed by the European Pact. We know that the pressure on the roads means that the flux are moving around, but are not stopped. There are numerous tragedies and creates more and more victims that cannot be helped by the NGOs. In these conditions, a dialogue is almost absent in our countries. Migrants cannot get the relevant status. That means they could move and work in security, in safety. They are tolerated, but they are excluded. people who are illegal are at the mercy of trafficked and smugglers and face constant violence. Populations are marginalized and create tensions within the communities. We can also say that the implementation of policies is now seen as a strategy by Europe to externalize the borders. Our societies need reforms that have been asked by the civil society. Poor population means that they want to migrate, and the poverty is now a trigger, and it involves more and more families and children. The crossings in the sea is a real issue that is not solved, and the traffics are corrupted. It is important to remember that in terms of human mobilities, the migration of competence is doing well. Employment market of Europe is attracting people. A lot of people, for example, doctors want to reach Europe to try to work there. I will now try to talk about the situation for each country. I just want to give you some elements to understand the context and the different dynamics. For Libya, as you know, Libya is the operational territory for the EU with a policy that is completely decided in Brussels. Huge means are put in place, and there is a private protection. It's like a private protection for the European countries. Violence, detention, extortions are numerous, and different training centers funded by Europe will not solve the problems. Many people are caught into the sea trying to cross the Mediterranean. Algeria. Migrants entering Algeria is increasing and reached a peak in 2021. According to security forces, the number of arrests has doubled in 1 year. And we noticed some massive deportation towards Nigeria and Mali. It is important to say that Algerian people is the first nationality of migrant reaching Spain through the sea. In Tunisia, the policy has been stopped for migrants for the last 4 years. As it was said for the FPDS reports and Lawyers Without Borders, the application and qualification of human smuggling is something that is a problem. Migrants are still illegal people, and the situation is stuck. A lot of boats have been arrested on the shores, Tunisian shores, trying to cross the sea. And there is a lot of pressure and tensions within the communities. As to Morocco now, there is a strong crispation of authorities, and the discussions with the European partners is blocked. Morocco has the role of African leaders now to try to pilot the African efforts within the migration issue. Beyond diplomatic position, the African Observatory for Migration could be a space for innovation. Mauritania has an increasing number of migrants who want to cross and go to Spain since 2020, creating tragedies. In 2021, more than 7,000 migrants have been deported to the border. And according to the figures communicated by the government, as to the reception of migrants who have Mauritania as main destination, migrants from Mali represent the first category of people. there is a creation of a permanent visa for them that corresponds to, that can be bought for $100. So the country is creating a new strategy now, and we need to say that the country is welcoming a refugee count of more than 60,000 people on its territory. To conclude, I need to give you a few more elements. After 2 years of the pandemic, the health crisis shows that there will be now a major social crisis because of more and more people falling into poverty and inequalities throughout the world. We now need to focus on alternatives to the economic model and rearrange the governance in order to develop coherent, responsive, and inclusive answers. As to the Maghreb region, we are in difficulty and the mechanism of solidarity is fragile. We are witness of the national states that are struggling to get organized. Young people are committed and there are a lot of activists and it's difficult to access funding. Promises and pledges made by the governments to fight against smugglers is the base, but this is not real on the ground and there are very little efficiency. The smugglers are still developing and make business with the migrants. Now we try to regulate those flux. But despite the discourses, the implementation of efficient policies are very difficult and dialogue between the social partners is difficult. I want to conclude saying that it is very important to say that this situation is a consequence of the policies and it is not a fatality. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. That was very clear. I will now give the floor to the last speaker before the break. Break for everyone. So the last speaker is Maria Jimenez Castro. She speaks for the association ELIN. Maria will tell us about the situation of migrants at the European borders, but we're going to talk about specific border. And we will try to show the impact of the pact on the southern border of Europe. And we will talk about a specific case. Maria, you've got the floor. Alors, tout d'abord, de la part de l'organisation, je vous remercie de m'avoir invité à participer à ce webinaire. C'est un plaisir pour nous d'être avec vous aujourd'hui, de parler de la réalité sur laquelle nous sommes confrontés avec les frontières sûres. Nous voulons remercier les interprètes pour le travail extraordinaire qu'ils font. Et je sais que ce n'est pas facile. Merci. Avant que nous commencions, je voudrais rapidement vous présenter l'organisation pour laquelle je travaille. Son nom s'appelle ELIN. C'est une organisation qui est basée sur la ville de Ceuta, qui a travaillé depuis 1999 et c'est une organisation complètement indépendante. Ça veut dire qu'elle ne dépend d'aucun gouvernement ou de financement gouvernementaux. Pour nous, c'est une oasis parce que c'est un endroit où, après un long voyage, on peut récupérer la force et la dignité qui a été enlevée et on essaye d'aller de l'avant. C'est un endroit où on partage nos valeurs, nos cultures et où nous grandissons ensemble. Il y a trois piliers principaux pour l'association. Le premier est la bienvenue. Tout d'abord, on travaille avec les autres personnes, on les accueille et ces personnes vont commencer à apprendre l'espagnol pour pouvoir partager des valeurs basiques et se traiter de façon égale et équitable. Le deuxième élément, c'est sensibiliser les gens. Nous avons des écoles, des sports, etc. Et il faut que les gens aient conscience de la réalité de la migration et qu'ils aient bien conscience des faits et leur dire que finalement, on a beaucoup de choses en commun avec ces gens qui arrivent. Et le troisième pilier, c'est dénoncer. Comme vous pouvez imaginer, il y a énormément de violations des droits de l'homme qui sont constamment faites sur les frontières. Donc, on veut réagir et se décider à parler aux médias et on organise des manifestations, comme vous pouvez voir sur la photo, qui sont organisées chaque année. C'est une façon de se plaindre et de dire que ce n'est pas l'Europe qu'on veut et on doit tous être responsables des actions prises. Alors, pour vous redonner un petit peu de contexte sur là où nous nous situons. Alors, Ceuta est situé dans l'Afrique du Nord et il constitue la frontière avec le Maroc. Elles ne font pas partie de l'union douanière. Il y a aussi, ils sont aussi des exceptions dans les accords Schengen. Il n'y a pas de liberté de mouvement dans ces villes-là. Donc, Ceuta et Melilla appartiennent à l'Espagne et ils appartenaient avant à l'Europe. Et ces deux villes sont devenues des endroits stratégiques et très importants pour les politiques migratoires européennes. Donc, ce sont les seuls territoires européens qui sont situés sur le continent africain. Petit à petit, il y a eu un procédé de fortification de ces deux villes et aujourd'hui, on appelle ça la forteresse de l'Europe. De façon traditionnelle, ce sont des villes où les gens venaient, rentraient et sortaient au quotidien et ils venaient à Ceuta pour travailler, faire du shopping. Ils traversaient la frontière sans problème. Mais il y a eu des changements et ça a créé une réalité sociale et économique très particulière avec des échanges qui étaient vraiment particuliers et spécifiques sur ce contexte frontalier. On avait des situations très spécifiques avec des mouvements transnationaux et c'était des gens où les gens ne restaient pas, c'était uniquement des transitions. C'était des lieux de passage, un endroit où ils restaient et ils pouvaient. Un autre élément spécifique, il y a des activités économiques qui se sont mises en place avec le Maroc et plus précisément avec les femmes qui venaient et qui travaillaient à Ceuta et qui repartaient ensuite. Il y avait des activités économiques comme le transport des biens, des femmes qui portaient des valises et qui faisaient des activités et qui retournaient dans la ville et vendaient des biens. C'est aussi le cas pour les travailleurs du sexe et les travailleurs domestiques. Il y avait aussi du marché noir qui a toujours été important il représentait 700 millions d'euros par année. Donc, d'un point de vue juridique, les frontières de Ceuta et Melilla constituent sans doute une contradiction de la mondialisation. Mais on a besoin de reconnaître cette activité économique qui se passe sur ces deux villes. Alors, l'immigration sur la frontière sud est subordonnée entre l'Espagne et l'Europe d'un côté et le Maroc de l'autre.
Absolutely none of the things that happen in the southern border related to migration happens out of the blue, by chance, or just spontaneously. Everything that takes place has a whole background of political and economical interests between the EU and Morocco. And therefore, migrant people, as we say, finally become a bargaining chip, a tool that is used to put pressure on the EU and Spain to get economical or political benefits. Regardless of who is in the government of Spain, There are four main issues in this sense. The first of all is the sovereignty of the city of Ceuta and Melilla. The second one is the occupation of the Sahara. Thirdly, trade agreements. And fourthly, migration. So since 2000, more or less, agreements between the two countries have been based on these four topics. And on the one hand, Spain and the EU have granted large sums of money to Morocco, has also provided it with border control and equipment, and has given from time to time certain political concessions regarding these four topics that I've just mentioned. In turn, Morocco would become a sort of agent of migration control through the constant violation of human rights and, of course, constant violence and persecution. All in all, of course, Morocco is not a safe place for migrant people. And of course, it's not a place where they should be sent back and deported because their life is constantly at threat. So I would like to briefly go through some of the events that have taken place in the past few years. It would be impossible to go through all of them, but some of them have been particularly important. In 2013, some cooperation agreements between Morocco and Spain were taking place, and Morocco didn't agree with particular points of those agreements. So it started to put some pressure on Spain, letting some people cross the border. Then later on in 2014, the Tarjal tragedy took place. Some people tried to reach Ceuta, and some of them were trying to swim to reach the beach of the Tarjal, which is the one you can see in the background picture. It is right next to the border fence. So while they were trying to swim and reach the city of Ceuta, they were fired with rubber balls and tear gas, and as a result, they died. It's a tragedy we still remember year after year in the March for Dignity. After that, of course, the government of Spain had to sort of clean up their image, and started a collaboration strategy with Morocco, who started asking for more and more money. In 2017, Morocco started to ask Spain to comply with certain agricultural Sahara agreements, and as Spain did not comply with those requirements, Morocco would let more than 850 people arrive at Ceuta. As you can see, every time there is an event taking place related to migration, it will be tightly linked to something related to a political conflict between these two countries. Moving forward to 2018, more than 600 people crossed the border, and as a result, Spain granted Morocco 75 off-road vehicles worth more than 2 million euros. 116 people arrived at Ceuta later on that same year, and they stayed the night in Ceuta, and the morning after they were taken back to Morocco. It was the first and only express deportation that has ever taken place in the city. Moving forward to 2019, the border fences increased from 6 meters up to 10 meters. The EU granted 140 million euros to Morocco, and Spain granted an additional 30 million euros to Morocco. That way, Morocco started to intensify border control both in land and in sea. And this is the year we saw the last big entry up to date. 115 people managed to cross the border. As you can imagine, with the pandemic, borders were closed, logically, but they remain closed up to date. Families have been divided in the two sides of the fence, and it has become extremely difficult to cross the border. We've seen some entries sporadically, either jumping the fence or trying to swim around it, but it hasn't become very frequent recently. And finally, in 2021, as you might already know, of course, Spain hosted one of the main leaders of the Polisario Front, and as a consequence, Morocco decided to let more than 8,000 people enter Ceuta, among which more than 1,500 minors. During those days in May 2021, we saw how many people were taken and sent back to Morocco. It didn't matter whether they were minor or adults. It didn't matter whether they were men or women. It didn't matter at all the country of origin, if they had come from Morocco or from sub-Saharan countries. They were constantly sent back to Morocco, putting their lives at risk. So as you can see, the permeability of the border is not the same throughout time, but rather it's highly dependent on the interests of Morocco and its international relationships. And more specifically, on the degree to which Spain and the EU responds to the interests and needs of Morocco. Regarding the Canary Islands, as you can imagine, the closure of the borders of Ceuta and Melilla has led to increasing difficulty to enter these cities, and therefore a dramatic increase in the arrivals to the Canary Islands. Even though it is the route with the highest mortality rates, people just have to assume that danger because the Mediterranean routes have been highly militarized. As you can see in these statistics provided by Walking Borders, of the year 2021, more than 4,000 victims died on the access routes to Spain. Most of them, 4,016 victims, correspond to the Canary Island routes. That is the vast majority. And unfortunately, these figures do not account for all the people who have died. There are so many shipwrecks we don't know about. There are so many lives that have been lost trying to reach our coast we will never know about, because 95% almost of the victims disappear without their bodies being identified and recovered, without their families being able to grieve for their death. So once people arrive at the cities of Ceuta and Melilla, some of them, but not all of them, are sent to the CETI, C-E-T-I, which in Spanish stands for Temporary Immigrant Stay Center. In Ceuta, it has a maximum capacity of 512 people. It is an open center, people can come and go, but it has a schedule and certain rules that people, of course, have to comply with. There is no specific criteria to accept people to live there. Sometimes people from a certain country will be accepted and will be able to live there. And other times the government will decide they cannot live there. So it just depends on the government's will. And although it has a maximum capacity of 500 people, more or less, sometimes it has hosted up to 1,000 people living in overcrowded, subhuman conditions. Living Ceuta and Melilla is a tricky question. We always say, you know the day you arrived, but you never know the day you will leave. There are bilateral extradition agreements between the EU and countries of origin to speed up deportations. So people just end up lying about their country of origin, about their whole identity, because they fear being returned to the country of origin, or even worse, being returned to Morocco. So people just have to wait for the government to grant them a permit to leave and to go to the Spanish mainland, and never know the place where they will go or when they will leave. We've seen people stay just for 2-3 months, and we've seen people who have stayed up to 4 years waiting without knowing when they would leave. Even more concerning is the situation of asylum seekers. Legally, they do have the right to move freely throughout the Spanish territory. However, this has not always been respected in the cities of Ceuta and Melilla, because they were forced to stay until the government would let them leave. It wasn't until, well, of course, this is a violation of the Article 19 of the Spanish Constitution, as well as the asylum law. And it wasn't up to July 2020 when the Spanish Supreme Court stated that there was no Spanish nor European law that should prevent people, that should block people from moving freely throughout the Spanish territory. Nowadays, and especially in the wake of the events that took place in May 2021 that I explained before, once the application of asylum is accepted for examination, people are allowed to leave if they will to do so, and they can go to the Spanish mainland. The situation in the Canary Islands is more or less similar to that of Spain. Of that of Ceuta and Melilla. People are not allowed either to move freely throughout the Spanish territory, and they have to wait for the government to grant them a permit to travel to the Spanish mainland. And with the increase in arrivals in 2021, we've seen that the resources provided to those people arriving to the Canary Islands have not been sufficient and have not been adequate at all. At the beginning, it's something that could be understandable as it's an emergency situation. But more than 1 year has passed, and this situation remains exactly the same. People are having to stay up to date in precarious camps, in overcrowded conditions, in subhuman conditions in general. And it's not a matter of
Et ce n'est pas traité comme une urgence.
So faced with this reality, what the Spanish government and the European Union decided to do is granting extra economic support to Morocco, of course, to try to prevent those arrivals. So all in all, when we read the European Pact and try to understand it, what we have the feeling is that these are practices that have already been taking place in Ceuta for really long and that are still in place in Ceuta and Melilla. Cooperation agreements with third country, far from benefiting migrant people, lead to the militarization of routes and put people's life in danger because it forces them to take more dangerous routes, such as the Canary Island routes, leading to thousands and thousands of deaths. And then granting millions of euros to Morocco does not translate into increased security or better reception resources for the people who arrived there, but rather translates into violence, repression, and human rights violation, putting people's life at risk all the time. Regarding the filtering process, so as to carry out deportation quickly, if it wasn't because Morocco does not accept deportations anymore, they would already be taking place in Ceuta and Melilla all the time. The policies they will then implement in the rest of the European Union. We are far from being experts in law or in politics. We just know the reality of the people who arrive at our cities firsthand. We believe that migration is a source of wealth, and we do not mean by all means economic wealth, financial wealth, or demographic wealth. Rather, we mean a non-material wealth that every person has, and we can only discover when we look at each other in the eyes in terms of equality. And this equality, in our opinion, should lay the foundations of the EU policies in terms of migration, issuing visas, reception resources, legal and safe pathways. We believe it's the only way to move towards a European Union that does not reject, that does not discriminate, but rather a European Union that invests in welcoming other people and looking at each other in the eyes as equals. So this is the end of my presentation. If you have any question, we'll be more than happy to answer to them. And on the down part of the screen, you can see our social media in case you want to follow us and get in touch. Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bonjour, nous allons reprendre le webinaire.
Hello again, everybody. We're going to get back to our webinar and move to the political sides of things in the largest possible sense. We're going to talk about negotiations that took place around the Pact with regard to the EU and also the African Union. So I'd like to start off by passing the floor to Mrs. Saskia Brikmont, who is a Eurodeputee for Belgium in the European Parliament, and she's been very much involved in the negotiations on the Pact. So I will pass you the floor, Mrs. Brikmont. Thank you very much for your invitation to speak to you today and express the points of view of the Parliament and the situation with regard to the negotiations on the Pact. I'd like to thank all the previous speakers. I've attentively listened to your presentations and I very much took on board what you said. I share the statement with regard to some of the problems surrounding current migration policy and indeed the new pact as well that is on the table, with negotiations very much taking place in Parliament at the moment. I'd like to share the very powerful conclusion that Maria Jimenez expressed as well with regard to the absolute necessity to have a human migratory policy and to really take on board these key human rights issues. I'm going to concentrate today on the content of the pact. I am also going to look at some of the approaches around this when it comes to the Parliament itself. And just to come back rapidly on some of the foundation points, perhaps. I'm not going to be able to get really into the details, and I know that a lot of these things have already been said by our previous speakers anyway, but the pact was presented by the European Commission in September 2020. It was published in a context of indignation after the fire in the Moria camp in Greece. And this had really caused a stir among the European decision makers and parliamentarians. So you can remember maybe the No More Moria from Commissioner Johansson. The idea, therefore, was that this new pact was going to take into account the issues at stake. It's a pact that had already been presented by the European Commission in the past, in 2016, in fact, named the Common European Asylum System. And it was a negotiation of an agreement with the European Parliament reached in 2017 on the reform of the Dublin system. However, there were blockages by member states in the Council in 2018, and so these texts were not adopted in the end. We've already heard about the various regulations that were agreed upon in this pact. So the 5 legislative proposals, 2 of which are reforms of the package presented in 2016, and 3 non-legislative proposals in the form of recommendations for member states, so non-binding recommendations. So there are negotiations ongoing in the European Parliament of the text presented under the previous mandate. So there's a regulation on the eligibility for international protection, the Reception Standards Directive, the Return Directive, and the Resettlement Regulation. The Commission, in parallel, also adopted a strategy on voluntary return and reintegration. This was in April 2021, and also in September 2021, an action plan against migrant smuggling for 2021 to 2025. So these are some strategies and plans, but not laws that have been adopted. So they are non-binding as yet. In December of last year, the Commission presented a legislative proposal for the reform of the Schengen area, and also a proposal for a regulation to deal with situations of abuse in the field of migration and asylum. These proposals followed on from the situation on the border between Poland and Belarus. The Commission has also announced a publication of a skills and talents package on legal migration by the end of April 2022. So as I said at the beginning, we hoped the Commission was going to come back with some real solutions to solve some of the problems surrounding the Dublin system and the various parts of reforming parts of the policy. We could say that our hopes were very much dashed very quickly, and we've seen this morning why. There are various problems, particularly the idea of building a European fortress. We've also seen how there were various effects with regard to the announcement of the pact and the way in which the terminology was used. So we had talk of abolishing the Dublin system, for example, but when we read the text, we can see that that's not really the case. Because the principle of the country of first entry isn't really questioned. And this is a source of many obstacles to a more effective and humane policy. So we could say that this is a pact that has been drafted fundamentally to respond to the expectations of member states that are very much sensitive to the alarm bells that are being rung by the extreme right. So the migration issue being presented as a problem rather than as an opportunity, a human adventure, a solidarity adventure. So we can see the list of the various proposals in progress at the level of the European Commission, and the legislative frenzy to really try to fill some gaps in legislation. Very frequently we see that it's not really an issue of absence of legislation, but non-application or bad application of legislation. So this legislative frenzy is not accompanied by impact studies or indeed independent evaluation. And this is a big problem that we've identified. We also are very worried about the fact that some of the proposals on the table want to really legalize non-legal or illegal practices. Proposals that we've seen being put on the table by certain member states are really problematic from a legal point of view. So flexibility issues linked to the Schengen regulation, some issues surrounding external controls on European borders, and other practices and issues that really do link to the security situation but undermine certain key principles. So within the European Parliament, after the publication in September 2020, we were actually tasked with looking at the file. We have a commission now working specifically on this. This is the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and I'm involved with this. Each political group involved obviously looks at the situation and what's on the table from their point of view, and they have various responsible members of parliament, shadow reporters, etc., who monitor the negotiation. There's a political group with the role of reporter for each text, and the idea is therefore that we can make proposals for each dossier, and this is where we are at the moment when it comes to the text of the pact. So the rapporteurs have now drafted their basic texts. The shadow reporters will then propose their amendments, and there will be negotiations around this. We have to therefore find a compromise between the different groups. So these texts from the rapporteurs need to be submitted in a context where there are various groups involved with actually scrutinizing the information. It's not a public sitting, but if you're interested, I can give you some information about how these informations are actually shared with certain parties. Once this negotiation phase has happened and there has been an established position within the council, then the principle is that there is a schedule put in place for the principal trilogue phase. This is the negotiation between the three different bodies: the European Parliament, the Council to the Member States, and the European Commission. We are currently in 2022, and we are really looking at the time lapse between the first publication of the text then in 2020 and this stage that we are in right now. I'm going to give you an example of the real scope of the negotiations on this file. If we talk about the AMMR reform. So this was a regulation on asylum and migration management, which includes the reform of the Dublin system. There are 2,400 amendments that have been proposed by the various political groups. So just to give you an idea of the way in which these consultations can take a huge scope of the various different political groups involved, the views at play, the groups that are more conservative or more liberal, and it's a real huge negotiation process. At the moment, we are looking at the fact that the texts need to be taken as a whole. We can't have each text looked at in isolation. So the idea is that you really have to make sure that it's taken into context as a whole package. As I mentioned, the group that I'm working with is looking at some analysis of the links between texts, but also separate elements, to try to foster a certain level of consensus. At the moment, this package approach, however, is really something that the Parliament is emphasising. So we're starting the negotiations, I would say, to see what majorities are going to emerge within the Parliament. Cecile, let me know how much time I've got left, please, because I wasn't very good at monitoring my timing. Or would you like me to wrap up? Perhaps 1 or 2 more minutes, thanks. Perhaps until 15:15, if you like. Perfect, thank you. So what I would propose then, if you'd like any more information on the negotiations currently ongoing, like the rapporteurs' reports, etc., then it's important to be aware that the positioning on each file does depend a lot on the rapporteurs themselves, because at the moment we're very much in the thick of it. With regard to the process, if we talk about the screening regulation, for example, there's a socialist rapporteur working on this, Madame Sipol, and so we can see that there are points of information being put online, very much being shared with NGOs, those working on the ground, etc. But if we contrast this with other rapporteurs working on other areas, there's Mr. Busade, for example, who's very much a far right politician, and it's more difficult to actually get access to the proposals being made. There's the proposal around actually decreasing the age of certain individuals being taken into account. So what I wanted to say anyway, most importantly, is that we do have to take into account the background of the various rapporteurs working on different elements of this text. They can come from very different political points of view. To conclude then, I'd like to just perhaps reiterate something I said at the beginning when it comes to the critical positions that we can take vis-a-vis certain points contained in this pact. I think we have to try to underline the need for a constructive approach when we're analysing and negotiating the pact. The idea is really to try to place specific attention on some of the issues surrounding, for example, the retention of hotspots. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail here. The increased use of detention as well, which is something that's very problematic. for us, the principle of Dublin, so the first entry principle. It's a principle that remains the country of first entry, so we're not really overhauling the Dublin system here. Also, the solidarity principle in inverted commas, because this solidarity principle can take various different facets, some of which are not really linked to what we would generally or usually categorize as solidarity. So we can also talk about support for deportation being included in this category. There's also many issues surrounding a failure to respect the best interests of children. So despite the principles that are very much enshrined in our text on respecting the best interests of children, there are certain elements of these proposals that are now really undermining these basic rights and principles. There's also a lack of fundamental rights monitoring. This is the major gap, I feel, when we're in this context of recurring violation of human rights on the borders, and these illegal pushbacks. We saw in the chat, actually, somebody talked about the fact that we hadn't yet made reference to Frontex. So perhaps we could talk about Frontex here, just in passing. It's another element of worry, preoccupation for us that we're working on, particularly with regard to this issue of fundamental rights monitoring. We have an inquiry also ongoing by a body dealing specifically with fraud, and this is going to confirm some of the problems that have been already flagged up, I feel, with regard to this context. The member states, I think, do have different ideas on this. There's a lack of procedural safeguards as well that has been set out in detail, I think, previously today in our webinar. Data protection is a key issue, perhaps a less visible issue, but something that we are very much trying to flag up, and I'm working on other files on this. So how are elements of personal data being collected? And this can be sometimes very problematic when it comes to the respect to for fundamental data protection rights for individuals being considered within migration procedures. There are real risks, I think, linked to the security of this data. There is also an issue linked to the European databases being linked to migratory databases that are actually being used within other contexts. So for the police, for criminality investigations, etc. Another final point that I wanted to flag up is the crisis categorization that has been suggested as something that will allow us to override certain fundamental and basic provisions linked to human rights, etc. So when is this acceptable? We mustn't have like a general overriding of these principles because everything is characterized as a crisis. I think that's it. Thank you very much for your attention today.
We now give the floor to Madame Jacob, who is permanent representation of Belgium to the EU, and she's responsible for asylum and the situation of migrants. She is following with a lot of attention the evolutions of the European Pact. Madame Jacob, you've got the floor. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. Sorry, I had some problems with my sound before starting my intervention. I want to focus on the history of the negotiations, and I want to talk about the difficulties met for the negotiations of the pact. And I think we need to understand the background and the situation. And as it was mentioned before, the failure of the reform that was proposed in 2018, because the pact has its origin into the background and into this failure of negotiations. And the Commission has tried to accommodate the divergent visions and the different points of views of the member states. Some have a stronger national interests. These are the result of specific national interests and the different challenges in migration management. I will tell you about the background. So in 2015, we are all aware of that. We had some massive flows of people moving to Greece, a lot of secondary flows also towards the member states of the south of Europe. At that time, people realize that there is a crisis, but unfortunately, the European asylum system is not designed for crisis management at large flows of arrival. So they are adopting some emergency measures with the Article 7 of the European Union functioning that enables the Council, in the case of large flows, the Council is adopting decisions of relocalization. And at that time, there are already problems with the question of the relocation decisions, especially from the Visegrad group of countries, because Hungary, for example, did not support this measure. And this is where we saw the first crispation, the first problems linked to the migration crisis and the first tensions. In 2016, the Commission published two legislative packages aimed at reforming the European asylum policy. And it is the cornerstone of the reform. And they are aiming to put in place more efficient procedures and also a solidarity mechanism. In 2017, negotiation on asylum reform slowly begin to stall, and internal border controls remain in place. And the Commission issues a communication aimed at returning to the normal functioning of Schengen, and a proposal for a revision of the Schengen Border Code, which will not succeed. There will be a second round of negotiation. In 2018, with the Bulgarian presidency, there are agreements and some asylum files are rejected, where some member states do not want to break with the package approach. People disagree and countries disagree. On top of that, the Council cannot agree on key issues of Dublin, which means that the situation is stuck. So the Council, no mandate can be given on those two proposals for AP and Dublin. Second half of 2018, we've got Austrian presidency, and there are some attempts to finalize some of the less controversial asylum dossier. And discussions are abandoned. And the asylum reform is still standstill. So it is important to understand the background and the political context at the time. There is situation of emergency because there is a crisis, humanitarian crisis. And there are a lot of tensions among the member states about relocalizations, and the national policies are calling for a consensus in the Council on asylum issues. The other constraint was to move forward into a package, but in 2018, it was completely blocked and it was stuck, especially for the agreement on certain dossiers. Especially when we talk about the harmonization of asylum proposals and asylum rights and international protection for all the member states. So all those elements mean that there is a blockage in the different proposals. And then in 2019, we're at the end of the legislature and installation of the new parliament and a new commission. This new commission announces that migration policy reform is a priority. But a few months later, we all know COVID enters the scene and will logically occupy an important place. However, the Commission will work behind the scenes to the creation of the Pact. The Pact was proposed in September 2020, following the Moria fire. And they want to reform the asylum and migration policy. And we have different elements in this pact that were amendments from the previous legislative pact, Eurodac, and the asylum procedure. So we keep the basics, but we add some elements and we make a few amendments to the proposal. Such as the screening proposal and the Dublin successor regulation. We try to introduce the regulation of crisis and force majeure, management of the borders, migration and crisis management, and asylum policy. So the political issues of the pact are obviously the screening procedures, the asylum and return procedures, the Dublin rules, and the solidarity mechanism. On that specific point, solidarity mechanism, there are many practical questions because of its complexity. This mechanism moves away from the simple question of fair share and almost automatic allocation of applicants according to the level of migratory pressure in the member states, and was the case in the 2016 reform. So it will be divided depending on the migration pressure according to the different member states. The Commission is trying here to set up a system that brings together the different positions of the member states. So we've got two parallel solidarity mechanisms, one linked to the search and rescue arrival, and another linked to the pressure situations. So the mechanism is anticipatory and is based on an advanced assessment of arrivals, whereas the mechanism linked to pressure situation is triggered by the Commission based on the assessment of the migration situation in the member states. So this mechanism allows for solidarity to be delivered in several ways and therefore to satisfy a majority of member states. So these different ways are relocation, return sponsorship, operational and financial support. There is also a mechanism, what we call a corrective mechanism, in case the commitments of the member states are not considered as being sufficient. I think soon as the pact came out, the German presidency chose to try to find a political agreement on the main principle of the pact. So the Mediterranean member states at this point, caution is the order of the day, as many questions remain on the functioning of the solidarity mechanism, but also on the balance of the proposals between the responsibility and solidarity stance. It is difficult to visualize and to see how all those proposals will come into force, and the German presidency will get the agreement in principle. So at that time, different member states will ask for the Commission to explain the functioning of the future systems. So these simulations are proposed by the Commission, and they can stimulate the discussions, but unfortunately, they're not convinced sufficient number of member states to allow substantial progress, particularly for the supporters and opponents of relocation. The design of the mechanism, which excludes from relocation persons subject to asylum procedures at the border, does not allow sufficient relocation to take place. They say that, look at this mechanism will exclude relocation. The corrective mechanism in case is insufficient commitment leads to de facto to a mandatory relocation component. So there is an assessment to see if the commitment from the member state is sufficient or not. So it is difficult to define what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So it is difficult to obtain political guidance, and the Portuguese presidency and the Slovene presidency decide to move forward to the proposal at the technical level. So at the technical level, we will make progress with the new asylum agency, which is something dating from 2016. So it is a progress that is positive and that goes against the package approach. But the political aspect points of divergence, such as the solidarity mechanism and border procedures, is still a problem. So the member states of Mediterranean area consider that solidarity foreseen in the pact does not offer them sufficient guarantees to accept the burden of the different border procedures. While destination member states consider that these procedures will limit secondary movements and thus the pressure on their normal asylum systems, which give them more room to participate in solidarity measures. And for some member states, compulsory relocation is seen as problematic, and it will act as a pull factor, whereas for southern member states, relocation should be the most important component of solidarity. As to the presidency of the Council, we are now under the French presidency. And the French presidency is well aware of the divergences of the critical point. And the French presidency decides to move away from the traditional negotiation framework and the technical discussions, technical working group, and the advisors, and they try to implement a step-by-step approach. So this step-by-step approach aims to move forward in stages and find elements of agreement under each stage. So these elements should be part of different strands. So we've got the border checks and registration, secondary movements, and solidarity. So I will talk about those three main points that are the most difficult points, but they are also external elements like improvement of cooperation in return and readmission. So the French presidency is offering a first step of this approach and focusing on the border focus on the border. So work focuses on screening and Eurodac. We'll see if it works. The establishment of a solidarity mechanism where relocation would be voluntary. So there should be the member states which would not participate in relocation would have to provide alternative solidarity contributions. And they are looking for a better application of the current Dublin rules. In this attempt, we're not talking about asylum procedures in the borders or compulsory returns, but we're trying to find a good balance between responsibility and solidarity, and that will be the next steps. So the objective is to have an agreement in principle on that first step, and then it will be implemented, and then the second step would come in. So the objective is, of course, to improve the level of confidence and enable easier negotiations between member states. So when we talk about perspectives now at this stage, it's still difficult to know what the future holds. However, the French presidency has shown some improvement and has restarted discussions. And the first step will be finalized. And we will be able to discuss the second step. Because we do not discuss the second step yet, because of course it will be dependent on how well the first step is going. The final step will obviously be a global agreement on the pact. Time of the essence because the legislature is moving forward, and it will correspond to the elections in May at the end of the legislature. We will need the main lines of the pact to be agreed with the European Parliament at the latest under the Spanish presidency. And the end of the legislature should be devoted to a technical finalization. So at the moment, everything seems possible and all options are open if the French strategy works. It is not impossible that the pact will be finalized before the end of the legislature. On the other hand, if this strategy does not lead to agreement, it will be difficult to find a way forward, as many avenues have already been explored. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and I'm available for any question if you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Jacob. I think this was a really interesting presentation. We've looked at the various tensions and divisions that have not at all been harmonised when it comes to the various groups and member states. We're now going to look at the African continent. Mrs. Nidirio Nadaye has presented her excuses. Unfortunately, she's not able to be here today with us. She has other commitment, but she has actually recorded a video for us today. So we're going to be able to see her presentation by video. She is a teacher and also a doctor, and she has been a feminist politician in Senegal and the deputy director also. So she's had quite a diverse and wide-ranging career, and we are very honoured to have her recorded video to talk about what's happening within Africa and the African Union.
Je voudrais saluer d'abord
Thank you very
REMIDEV,
much. I'd like
l'ensemble
to
des organisateurs également qui sont membres,
welcome
et
this
bien entendu la
opportunity
direction de
to speak
REMIDEV
to
qui
you
nous
today
fait
and thank the
encore
organisers for the
l'honneur de
invitation.
contribuer
It's a real honor
à
to be
ce
able to
débat.
contribute to this
En fait,
important
on est tous en
debate
plus
and event.
dans nos différentes
We
structures,
are
dans nos
all in
différents
our
réseaux,
various
en train
organizations and various
d'analyser
networks
les
in the
rapports entre l'Union
process of
africaine et l'Union
analysing
européenne
the relationship between
selon
the Union,
l'axe
the African
du
Union
pacte
and the
européen sur
European
la migration
Union in
et
the
l'asile
context of this
et un
new
peu plus
pact
largement d'ailleurs, un
on
peu plus
immigration
globalement
and
sur
asylum,
la
and
gouvernance de la
also on
migration
a more
et
level,
les
an
rapports
overall
entre
level,
l'Europe
the
et l'Afrique.
governance of migration and
Je voudrais donc
the
saluer toute
relationship
l'assistance
between Europe and Africa,
et
particularly in this
dire que je
migratory
suis contente d'être
context.
avec,
I'd
pouvoir
like
au
to
moins
just
dialoguer avec
express
vous
how pleased
pour
I
un
am to
moment.
have this
C'est que
opportunity to
ce
actually
webinaire
enter
a
into
été
a dialogue
fixé,
with
la date
you.
a été fixée alors que j'avais déjà
This,
d'autres
unfortunately,
engagements
I already
dont je ne
had
peux me
other
soustraire.
engagements, commitments in place when I received the
Il m'a
dates
été
of
donc
this webinar,
demandé
so I've had
de
to
dire
send in my video
quelques mots
today. But
sur
I wanted to
la
say
position de
a
l'Union
few
africaine
words on
sur
the
le volet
position of the
migratoire,
African
mais
Union,
également sur les
particularly with
relations de
regard
partenariat
to
entre l'Union
the
européenne
migratory
et l'Union
context and our
africaine,
relationship with the
quelle
EU.
place la société civile y
Where
occupe,
does civil
et enfin
society fit into this
de dire
context
un petit
as
peu
well?
ce que
And I
l'on
wanted to
pense
also say a
ce que
little bit
l'Union
about
africaine
what the
pourrait
African
tirer
Union
de ce pacte européen
thinks
sur la migration et
they
l'asile.
can actually
D'abord, pour ce qui est du volet migratoire
analyse
et
and
au niveau africain,
evaluate with regards
je crois
to the
qu'il
impacts of
faut
this new
que nous
pact.
retenions une bonne fois
To
pour
begin
toutes
with,
que
I think
les
it's
mouvements
important
migratoires africains
to
sont
look at African
essentiellement
migratory
intercontinentaux
movements as
et
essentially intercontinental
se
movements.
font souvent de
These
manière
are
régionale ou régionale.
often
C'est la raison pour
sub-regional
laquelle
or
l'Union
regional
africaine et la plupart
flows.
des communautés
And
économiques
so
régionales,
the
les
African
CER,
Union
ont
and the
adopté des
majority
agendas
of our
complets sur
economic
l'immigration et sur la
communities
mobilité de
do have
main-d'œuvre surtout.
their own
L'Union
ways of
africaine
actually
s'évertue
handling
à donner le ton
migration,
et à jouer un
and
rôle de
we have
coordonnateur et de
been
médiateur entre
coordinating
les approches nationales,
various
régionales et
national
continentales
approaches,
en
playing a
matière
kind of
de gouvernance des
mediator's
migrations.
role when it comes to
Les
governing
communautés
and
économiques
governance of
régionales
migration.
s'emploient
Our
à faire de
economic regional
même
communities
à leur
are
niveau.
also
En substance, les
taking
agendas continentaux,
responsibility
régionaux en
for
matière de
some of the
migration s'avèrent
continental and
relativement
regional
complets
agendas on
et
migration.
prévoient
So
un
we have quite
traitement séparé des divers
a
aspects qui sont
well-established
traités.
context now when it
Mais
comes to
comme
dealing with various aspects of
il se
migration.
concentre principalement sur la
We
mobilité de la main-d'œuvre surtout et la
mainly
libre circulation des
concentrate
personnes,
on
il y
the
a des défis,
mobility
il y a de
of
nombreux défis qui persistent
workers,
dans
and
la
there
mise
are
en œuvre d'une
various
gouvernance globale et
challenges that
inclusive des
remain when
migrations,
it comes to an
ainsi que dans
overall governance of migration.
l'intégration
And
même au niveau
the
africain
issue of
en vue d'une libre
integration within the
circulation
African
régionale ou
continent in a
continentale
more
des
general
travailleurs.
sense.
Toutefois, si les politiques mises en place par l'Union africaine au cours des 2
With regard
dernières
to the
décennies
policies
décrivent
set
un organe
in
politique continental
motion by
très
the African
progressiste
Union
dans sa
over the last few
réflexion
years,
et dans sa
we could
vision
characterize some of
de la
our
migration,
reflections and
eh bien,
visions
la
as
mise en
fairly
œuvre de ces
progressive when
politiques
it comes
par
to
ces États
migration.
membres a
There
tendance à
have
prendre
been
du
various
retard.
policies
La
rolled
révision du
out by
cadre
member
de politique
states, but there are
migratoire pour
delays
l'Afrique qui a
with
été
regard to
adoptée
this
en
as well.
2018
We
était une
had
occasion pour l'Union
a
africaine et
policy
pour ses États
adopted in
membres de
2018
reconnaître
by
l'importance des
the
cadres
African
politiques
Union,
et
recognizing
institutionnels
the importance
solides
of institutional
pour
and
gérer plus
political
efficacement
frameworks
la migration
to more
en tant que
effectively
composant
manage
clé du
migration
développement
as a
plutôt
key
que comme un
component of
problème
development within
brûlant
our continent.
qui est
So the
à
idea is to
résoudre.
not see this as a problem, but
Les
as a
cadres politiques
solution
et les
or an
positions sur la
opportunity.
migration
The
adoptées par
political
l'Union africaine
framework and positioning
commencent
on
à
migration
s'imprégner des
adopted by
réformes
the African
et des
Union
pratiques au niveau
is
national.
now
Et s'ils
also
sont
being linked to
pleinement
reforms on a national
mis
level
en
in
œuvre,
various
on
countries.
devrait avoir
And
le
we can see that
potentiel de
this really is
transformer
being
la gouvernance des
implemented
migrations sur le
with the
continent africain.
potential of transforming
S'il y a une chose
immigration
que
and migration
l'adoption
governance on the
récente de
African
l'accord
continent,
établissant la zone de libre-échange continentale
there
africaine
is an
et du
agreement on
protocole
our
du traité au
continental free
traité
exchange and free movement zone
instituant la
now.
communauté
There
économique
are various
africaine
protocols
relative à la
within
libre
the
circulation
African Economic
des
Community
personnes,
in terms of
au droit de
free
séjour, au droit
circulation of people,
d'établissement par l'Union africaine.
rights
Nous
to
apprenons
establish
que,
themselves in various countries of the African
en y
Union.
travaillant, nous nous
So
rendons
we
compte
now are
que
continuing to
s'il
work
existe
on
un
our
consensus
legal
général
frameworks
croissant
linked to
parmi les
this
États membres
general
de l'Union
consensus
africaine
and growing
sur le fait que
consensus
la migration fait
among our
partie
member states
intégrante
on the
de
fact that
l'intégration
migration
continentale
is an
et du
integral
programme de
part
développement
of our
économique et social de
continental
l'Afrique. Ça,
development
au moins,
on a
c'est une
social
donnée
and
claire
economic
et il y
level.
a un
I
consensus
think
pour
this is
l'ensemble des
something
États
that now
membres
is
de l'Union africaine sur
an
ce
element
constat-là.
that
En
member
revanche,
states agree
malgré
on,
l'existence
and
d'une
this is obviously
myriade
a
de mécanismes
positive
de dialogue
step forward.
migratoire
There's a
et de
whole
coopération
myriad of
interétatique sur
mechanisms
le
to
continent,
try to
il n'y a
regulate
pas
the
beaucoup de
cooperation
coopération
between
active et
member
permanente
states and
et de
countries on
partage
this issue.
d'informations
But we
sur la
still have
migration
work
entre les
to be
pays.
done in
Souvenez-vous
terms
juste
of sharing
les
information on
questions
migration
lancinantes
between
de
countries,
données statistiques sur la
how we
migration
actually
dans le continent.
produce statistics
Cela
on
entrave,
migration within
bien
our
entendu,
continent, etc.
cet état de fait
So
entrave
this means that
le processus
we
de collecte, de
have
rassemblement
certain
des
challenges
données
when it comes to actually
significatives et
collecting and
comparables
bringing
qui
together
pourraient éclairer les
significant and
responsables politiques
comparative
sur les tendances
data
et
to
les
really
tendances
track
continentales
trends
et ce faisant
and to look
contribuer à
at
assurer la pertinence et
flows.
l'applicabilité
I think
continue des
working on this
décisions
point would really
politiques au niveau
enable us
continental,
to
régional
reinforce our
et national.
policies and collaboration on a regional,
L'Afrique a fait
continental, and national level.
d'énormes progrès depuis
Africa
l'instauration
has made a lot
des
of
dialogues migratoires sur
progress
le
in
continent en
recent
2000.
years when it comes
Souvenez-vous de
to the
MIDSA,
issue of
mais également de
migration.
MIDOA pour ce qui est
You
de
can
l'Afrique de
maybe
l'Ouest. Toutefois,
remember
il
some
reste
of the
beaucoup à
Western
faire pour
Africa
que les plateformes de dialogue
situations of the
migratoire
past.
existantes
However, there
rassemblent
is a
les
lot to be
responsables africains
done
de la
still
migration
when it
pour des
comes
délibérations
to
soutenues, débouchant sur
really
une coopération pratique
reinforcing the
fondée
links
sur une
between
culture de
our
l'information et du
various
partage des données. C'est ce
countries,
que nous
particularly
appelons
when it
ici à
comes to sharing
AMLD
information and
les
data, as
processus
I
de
said.
consultation
So we need to
régionale
look at our consultation processes
parce
on a
que
regional
il y
level.
a,
It's important
en faisant ainsi, nous
to
facilitons le dialogue entre les
actually
États, entre
facilitate
les
dialogue
institutions
between
étatiques,
states,
entre
between
d'autres niveaux
institutions,
également qui ne sont
and
pas
other
des niveaux
levels, other
centraux de
organizations
décision
working not on a
autour de
governmental
la question
level, but
migratoire. Les données
on the
sont partagées,
issue of
l'information est
migration.
partagée et cela
So
facilite
how
une
can we
prise en
ensure
commun
that data is shared, information is shared, and that
de la décision.
common
En résumé,
decisions
l'Union
are able to be
africaine
made
progresse
based on
dans
this?
l'élaboration de positions
We
et de
are
cadres
making
politiques
progress
continentaux en
now
matière de
on
gouvernance des migrations, y
elaborating
compris sur le plan de la
conditions
libre
when it
circulation
comes
des
to
travailleurs ou à travers
migration and
des
also the
initiatives
free
telles que
movement
le
of
passeport
workers.
africain.
There are various
Certaines
initiatives
politiques sont
like the
mises en
African
œuvre, en
passport
particulier lorsque quelques
currently
puissances africaines y
being
trouvent leur intérêt.
tabled and
D'autres politiques, en
examined.
revanche, restent lettres
There are
mortes,
also
car tirées
policies
uniquement
that
par un
are
principe de solidarité
more
panafricaine,
focused
sans que des
on
dispositifs
solidarity.
institutionnels ne soient mis en place pour
There are
les mettre en œuvre.
institutional
L'agenda
devices
global de
that
l'Union
need to be
africaine en
set up
matière de
still
migration et de
linked to
développement
our
se heurte
global
donc
agenda
toujours
on
à de
migration
sérieux
within the
problèmes
European
de mise en
Union.
œuvre,
We
et
have
ceci
challenges
d'autant
linked
plus
to
que les intérêts de l'Union
implementation
africaine
in
à
practice.
l'égard de la gouvernance des
The
migrations
interest of the
n'est
African
pas
Union when it
n'est
comes
guère
to
aligné
migratory
sur
governance
ceux ou sur celui
needs
de
to
son principal soutien, qui est l'Union
be
européenne.
really translated
Alors,
into practical
que dire des relations
actions
entre
in a wider sense?
des relations de partenariat entre l'Union
We can look at
africaine
our partnership
et l'Union
relations
européenne.
now within the
Les
between the
migrations entre
Union,
l'Europe et
the African
l'Afrique
Union, and
autant
the
à des facteurs
European Union.
économiques,
So we
sécuritaires,
have economic
historiques et
factors,
culturels.
security
Les
factors,
migrations sont depuis longtemps
historical and
un enjeu
cultural factors to
économique,
examine
social et
here.
politique, tant pour les
We
pays
know
de
that
départ
migration is a
que pour
key
les pays
issue for
d'origine et même pour les pays de transit.
countries
Lors du
in
récent
Africa,
sommet donc, de l'Union africaine et de l'Union
countries of
européenne,
origin of
on a
countries, the transit countries, and of course the arrival countries.
5 partenariats.
So
on a
how
entendu
have the partnerships been
qui seraient
organised
d'accord
over the years? There are
sur
perhaps
5
5 key
partenariats
partnerships
qui
we
soulignent
can
leur
look
vision
at
commune
here
jusqu'en
that
2030.
really
Ces
underlines
5
the common
partenariats
vision
sont
up to
la
2020.
transition verte,
So
l'accès
the
à l'énergie,
green
la transformation
transition, access
numérique,
to
la
energy,
croissance durable et
digital
l'emploi, la
consumption,
paix et la gouvernance,
ongoing
la migration et la
sustainable
mobilité.
growth,
La
migration
genèse
and
du
mobility.
partenariat
So
entre
these are
l'Union
key
européenne et l'Union
areas of
africaine,
our partnership between the African Union
partenariat sur
and
la
the
migration
EU.
et la mobilité
And the partnership
remonte au
on
plan d'action
migration
conjoint
and
de La Valette
mobility
qui
goes back
avait été
to the
signé
La
en
Valette
2015,
Action
novembre
Plan,
2015,
signed in
à la suite de
2015,
cette
November
énorme crise
2015,
des
after
réfugiés.
the enormous
Et
crisis
ce partenariat
that we
stipulait 6 domaines d'action
experienced, the
autour de
refugee
la
crisis.
migration,
There are 6 areas of
comme
action
migration et développement,
concerning
migration
migration.
légale et
So migration and
mobilité,
development,
protection et
legal
asile,
migration and
prévention et lutte
mobility,
contre
protection
la
and
migration
asylum,
irrégulière, le
prevention
trafic des migrants,
of
la
illegal
traite des
migration,
êtres humains et
trafficking,
le retour, la
human
réadmission
trafficking,
et la
and
réintégration.
the issue of
Le bilan
readmission and
annuel du plan d'action pour 2021 montre toutefois que certains
report
domaines
for
d'action
2021
présentaient
shows
dans
that
leur
with
ensemble des
regard
résultats
to these
positifs
5
et encourageants.
areas of
Par
action,
contre,
there are some
certains
encouraging
axes,
points of progress.
certainement,
However, there
concernant
are
ceux
certain
concernant la migration
areas of
régulière,
this,
la mobilité,
particularly with regard
le
to
retour et la
regular
réadmission
legal
et l'intégration
migration,
n'ont pas
mobility,
encore
and
répondu aux attentes.
reintegration
En
and
effet,
return that
d'une
have
part,
not
les
been
Européens regrettent
fully
que l'effort des États africains ne soit pas plus volontaire dans les
respected,
domaines de la
and
lutte
where
contre les
there is a
migrations
lot of work still
irrégulières
to be done.
et la
So we need
réadmission
to look
de leurs
at
nationaux en
this
situation
issue
irrégulière
of
en Europe.
readmission. We need to look at this
D'autre
issue of
part,
controlling
les
what
Africains,
is
eux,
termed
soulignent le caractère
illegal
eurocentré des
migration.
objectifs censés
The
être
objectives of
être partagés
the
entre
new
les deux
pact
continents,
could be
des objectifs qui
classified as
semblent
rather
donner la priorité aux
Eurocentric.
intérêts européens
There seems
au
to be
détriment des
rather a
enjeux de développement
prioritization of
durable, de
European
paix et de
interests,
sécurité sur le continent africain.
perhaps to the
À
detriment
ce
of
stade, il est temps
sustainability and security
aujourd'hui
on the
pour les
African
deux
continent.
continents
We
d'engager un
therefore
dialogue
need to
réaliste
really try to
et
launch a
concerté,
realistic
non seulement
dialogue
pour dépasser les
between our two
malentendus,
bodies,
mais aussi
between the
pour mieux
African
construire
context and
ensemble
between the
un
European context,
partenariat
to really make sure
migratoire
that we can
qui protège les
construct,
migrants
build
dans leur
a real
intérêt à eux
partnership
tous.
together
En
in everybody's
2050,
interests.
l'Afrique comptera 2,5 milliards
In
d'habitants. À
2050,
une telle échelle, les
we
barrières et
will
les
hit
murs n'ont pas de sens.
unprecedented
Le besoin
levels
naturel de mobilité doit être pris en
demographic
considération.
levels, and particularly
Ceci, bien entendu,
levels of
nous
young
rappelle
people within
qu'aucune
our
efficacité
continent.
ne peut être
And so
atteinte sans un
migration
partage de
and
responsabilité entre
mobility is
l'Europe et
going to
l'Afrique.
continue to
Sans
be
partage des
absolutely
charges,
key. We
toutes les
must
politiques étroites ou
share
cloisonnées sont
responsibility.
vouées
We
à
must support each other when we look at the
l'inefficacité.
links between
C'est
Africa and Europe. We
particulièrement
must make
vrai
sure that our work
lorsqu'il
is
s'agit de
effective.
prévenir
This is
et de
particularly
démanteler
true
les
when it
réseaux de
comes to
passeurs qui
actually
disposent souvent de moyens énormes,
dismantling the
de
trafficking
technologies parfois
networks
très
that
sophistiquées
often
et qui exploitent
draw upon very
toujours la
sophisticated
vulnérabilité des
technologies
êtres
and
humains.
exploit the vulnerability of human beings.
Le partenariat Europe-Afrique donc doit être
The
rénové. Il
Europe-Africa
doit être
partnership must be
redynamisé.
therefore
Il doit être
renovated,
réarticulé
redynamized,
autour d'un
rearticulated,
référentiel différent.
restructured around
Et
a
cela
different
à la vue de
point
tous
of
les
reference.
éléments qui interagissent
We
dans
have to
ce
take into
dossier.
account
En
all the
effet,
interacting
l'Europe
elements
et l'Afrique,
with
tout
regard to the
récemment
new
donc à
pact and
Bruxelles,
how
ont décidé
Europe
de
and
progresser vers un
Africa
nouvel état d'esprit.
can
Et
really
les propos du
progress
président Macky
together.
Sall, président en exercice de l'Union
The
africaine, lors de la cérémonie de clôture
president
de
or
ce
current
sommet,
president of the
le marque
African
bien.
Union
Je le cite, il faut
has
créer aussi une nouvelle
talked
atmosphère de
about the
travail, une
creation
atmosphère
of a
mieux
new
adaptée
working
à la volonté
atmosphere,
politique que nous voulons
better
imprimer à ce
adapted to
partenariat.
our
Il faut
political will.
insuffler
When
un
it
nouvel
comes
état
to this
d'esprit
partnership,
aux
we have
relations
to really
euro-africaines.
breathe a
C'est
new
ce que j'ai
lease of
appelé,
life
celui qui
into
parle,
our
un nouveau
relationship.
logiciel
We
relationnel
need
fondé
new
sur une véritable vision de
relationship
partenariat pour une
logic
croissance et une
founded
prospérité
on
partagée.
real partnership and the
Fin
will
de
to
citation.
share
Il démontrait
growth and
ainsi
prosperity.
une réelle
So
volonté
this
des
was
États membres
actually a quote
à
from the
redessiner les
president of
contours
the
du
African
partenariat
Union
euro-Afrique
when it comes to
d'un
redesigning
point
the
de vue d'égal
the
à égal. Il
contours
faut aussi
of our
souligner que
partnership. We
pendant
need to
longtemps,
really
au moins pendant ces
underline
5
the
dernières années, nous
importance
avons
over the
suivi le
last
président
5
Macky Sall
years
et nous
of
avons
the work that our president has done in terms of trying to set up an equal partnership between countries of origin and host countries. It's important, I think, to continue to emphasize what he has said in terms of the absolute essential foundations that need to be in place in this respect. How can we build an egalitarian partnership? I think this is the key issue. We have to share the same language. We have to have a shared understanding. I think Europe is very interested in the issue of returns. Whether or not these are voluntary is perhaps a key question. At the end of the day, I think it's important that people are obviously given the opportunity to return to their country of origin if they so desire, but we also need to think about those who are expressing that this is not their will. So how do we support, therefore, this partnership? How do we look at this partnership in the context of our shared history, in the context of a cooperation dynamic, and above all, as we've said, as an egalitarian partnership? We know that there are systemic inequalities that are deep-rooted when we look at the Africa-Europe relationship. But how can we move on from this? How can we work together in an inclusive way to take into account the needs related to migration? Not only are our populations key stakeholders, but also civil society organizations working within this context. And I think it's very important to insist on egalitarian dialogues and egalitarian partnership, and the idea of refocusing our attention not only on this issue of returns, not only on the issue of sending people back to their countries of origin, but on development in its widest sense. How can we really reinforce our actions in this respect? I think it's very important to take a clear stance on this when it comes to migration. If we just set up a fortress, I think this will never resolve the issue. People are always going to try to penetrate the fortress. So how can we look at root causes, and how can we improve the situation and the relationship? Taking into account civil society is absolutely key when it comes to building this partnership, this renewed partnership. I think a constant approach is essential. There has to be a significant commitment from all key stakeholders, and this includes the civil society in all its diversity, particularly organizations that represent the main sectors of population involved in these contexts. The cooperation between the African Union and the European Union has to be based on common priorities, taking into account local realities and the potential solutions that exist. If not, the situation of imbalance is going to continue. We won't be able to move forward together.
En raison donc de ce partenariat déséquilibré et de l'exclusion de la société civile, des résultats qui sont
an exclusion of civil society within an unequal context has meant that many voices remain unheard. And I think it's important to look at the systemic and priority issues identified by the civil society organizations on the African continent. So issues, for example, voiced by young people, and we know that young people are now representing a very high percentage of the population of various African countries, the issue of cancellation of debt, human rights, economic, social and cultural rights and political rights, the exclusion of civil society in this kind of debate is a systemic issue. It's important, therefore, to re-examine this context as we analyse this new pact. We need to ensure that the results of our negotiations will be acceptable to both or all parties involved. So just to conclude now, with regard to this pact, I tried to just give you a general idea of the way in which we're analysing it, but I think this issue of returns is absolutely key. What form are these going to take? Are they voluntary returns? Yes. Okay, all well and good, but what do we do when these are not categorised as voluntary? What do we do in the case of forced return? How do we actually have a better decision-making process in place when it comes to this key issue? I think there is a real paradox and a lot of controversy surrounding some of the contradictions between what Europe wishes to do and what Africa wishes to do to really solve migratory issues. Migration, legal migration, is a central preoccupation for both Europe and Africa. We need to really place the emphasis on the need for legal migratory routes. This is absolutely the way that people want to go. We want to be able to obtain travel documents. We want to be able to move freely. When we look at the figures involved, actually, the number of illegal migrants is actually a lot lower than the number of people who are migrating very much with the right legal documentation, etc. So how do we perhaps look at this in a new light when it comes to acceptance and facilitation, particularly when it comes to this issue of returns? How do we move forward with our partnership? How do we look at the foundations linked to the partnership agreements, etc., since 2016? How do we look also at the figures, the numbers of individuals who have been sent back to their countries of origin? I think statistically there are some real issues surrounding the numbers presented and also the issue of tracking and statistics. I think that the African context is sometimes very much made visible through the media, and I think perhaps it's presented as more of an issue than it is maybe in the European context. So how can we perhaps better share information, raise awareness, really trying to follow the roots of asylum seekers and look at what's really happening with regard to individuals that are at the gates of Europe. We need to obviously take into account the COVID context as well. I think there is a lot to be done when it comes to this context, and the African Union is very much committed to working on these issues and collaborating to improve the current context. we
clair,
need to look at
juste
our
et
need for
fort
clear,
pour dire aux
fair
Européens, voilà ce que nous
arguments.
voulons.
How can we express exactly what we
Ce n'est pas un
want
marchandage
to our European
entre
counterparts?
les
How
migrants
can we get away
africains
from
et
this
la coopération
idea
européenne
of
ou les sources de développement
exchanges
européennes?
on an
Il
almost
s'agit des deux
merchandise
à la
type
fois
level?
qu'il
How
faut pouvoir
can
mettre sur
we
la
look
table et
at
regarder avec un
what
œil
can be
juste
put on the table by both sides
et respectueux des droits
as
des uns et
part
des
of
autres
an
pour que
egalitarian
ce partenariat
relationship,
Union européenne, Union
respecting the
africaine
rights of
puisse vivre.
all
Voilà ce
parties,
que je voulais dire. Je
respecting
crois que
this
j'ai été longue,
partnership.
mais
This
je
is
n'avais
what I
pas
wanted
le
to say.
choix.
I
Le
think I
sujet est
maybe
très,
went
très
over my time
difficile.
slightly, but
C'est un
I
sujet
find
aussi
this a
qui interpelle
very
tout le monde en ce moment.
difficult
Un sujet
subject
pour
and a
lequel nous
very
n'avons pas de réponse, que nous
topical
cherchons
subject
les
that's really
réponses. Mais
important
je
for
dis encore
everybody
une
at the
fois,
moment.
ni le
We
gouvernement
still
seul,
don't have real
ni la
answers,
société
but I
civile
think
seule
it's important to
n'est
look at
capable
the
de
fact
trouver
that governments
les
and civil
réponses aux
society
questions qui se
cannot
posent
find
dans
solutions
la
in
gestion, la
isolation. We
gouvernance de la migration
absolutely must
actuelle.
place
Je
the
vous remercie.
emphasis on collaboration. Thank you very much.
So we could listen to Madame Nyundai today during with her intervention. Thank you very much. We have talked about the framework. I hope that you've received all the basic elements about this pact and the implication that it had and also the background, the historical background. You can see where we are at the moment in terms of policies and in terms of negotiation. Even if the pact was presented in 2020, the situation is very tense. We talk about the strategies. Is that a good thing to implement this pact? Or do we need to act and make sure that the pact is completely suppressed, so deleted, and create a new one, so we don't really know what to do. And we are moving now to another part of this webinar. When we have studied all the implication of the pact, now we're going to talk about alternatives and what we can suggest and what are the options that we can implement. So we have two speakers. We've got Floor Dinden, who is one of my colleagues. He's here in Belgium, and he's migration research and advocacy officer for 11-11-11, and he's working for migration and justice in migration. And then we will give the floor to Charles Heller, who is the co-president of Migreurop, and who will give us his reflections. Floor, you've got the floor.
Cecile, and I would first of all like to thank also the previous speakers for their very interesting presentations and views on what is in terms of the pact on the table right now. I think all of these were very profound and coming from a range of perspectives, so very interesting to have this critical analysis of what is on the table right now, but I think that also leaves us a bit with a somewhat gloomy perspective on where we are. And I think it's important, and that's what we discussed as well, that it's, we didn't want to have you leave this meeting without also offering some more concrete proposals on the way forward. And I think that's an important message to bring also now in a context, political context, where we see that protection of asylum seekers and migrant rights are more and more under attack. And us as organizations defending migrant rights and individuals as well, we are a bit on the defensive here. But it's important to mention that we do have alternative proposals and concrete recommendations that we are also bringing to the table, also in the negotiations of the pact. And so as civil society in Belgium, we are working also on a technical level to follow up on different files and to be in touch with Belgian government on this. And so civil society overall everywhere in Europe. Other member states as well are doing this work on a technical level, but then also I think it's important that we have a more broader counter narrative on the alternative migration model that we try to put forward. And so from our side, as 1111, Alva and the colleagues of CNCD, 1111, and our member organizations, what we put forward is migration justice, and la justice migratoire is the concept that unites us. And so this brings us to the recommendations of the Pect, and so I will share them with you. What is crucial for us is that international solidarity is at the heart of the Pect. So that means for us that it's mobilizing the necessary means to fight extreme poverty and to tackle these the global inequalities, and that should be like the first goal also of the Pact, that we try to or that we put the focus on having less people forced into forced migration, and to have to make migration actually a positive decision, that people don't have to go in migration because there are no livelihoods in their countries of origin, that we offer concrete perspectives on poverty reduction. And so this is very important. This brings us also to the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals that are targeted towards those goals. And so we have to stop actually hijacking or letting these development budgets being hijacked by migration interests, or at least European interests of reducing migration to European countries. Also in the new instrument, and the ICI, this is very important that we're vigilant about these budgets, and that they go to the proper goals, which are poverty and inequalities. And so that brings me also to the Global Compact, the United Nations Global Compact for Migration, which is much more aligned with these goals. And so this the Global Compact is not it's not perfect from our eyes as civil society, but it is more balanced, since it takes into account also the interests of non-European countries. And we think that the Pact, the new Pact of the EU, that it should be more aligned with the Global Compact. More concretely on the Pact proposals itself, we think that we have to, or we are resisting actually the outsourcing of more migration management to third countries. And so what we put forward is these more balanced and inclusive partnerships with countries in the global south. So we need these to be more balanced, and that brings us to, for example, safe and legal migration pathways. They should be at heart of the Pact, and also of these relations. So this means better access to family reunification, better access to labor migration policies, humanitarian visa, student visa, tourist visa, and then higher numbers of resettlement. This all should be part of this offering safe and legal channels for migration. And we don't see that, we don't see enough concrete proposals on all of these different aspects in the Pact as it is now on the table. So this is crucial in building these equal partnerships with third countries. But it is also crucial in, if you want to tackle irregular migration, you have to offer legal migration, of course, because this irregular migration is a consequence of the lack of legal pathways. So creating these legal channels will save lives and avoid people making dangerous journeys. And that brings me also to the next point. Something that we put forward for the Pact is also the lives lost at sea in the Mediterranean. What we stand for is, what we ask member states to put on the table is a coordinated search and rescue operation in the central Mediterranean to save lives, and then also coupled to this, of course, a mechanism for disembarkation, and then also the member states play a role in reception of people rescued at sea. Then the hotspot approach that is central in the Pect proposals of sorting and filtering with accelerated asylum procedures for people based on the third country concept. So that's something that we oppose, and also because this is what we are afraid that it will lead to arbitrary detention on a massive scale. Also mentioned earlier by Sarah of EuromedRights. The projections of people in detention that we will have is massive. And so we need, on the other hand, we propose alternatives for detention. And so there are a lot of interesting practices, I think, when it comes to alternatives in different member states, and we do not see this in the Pact itself. Then the solidarity mechanism, the flexible solidarity, which was discussed earlier as well. What we think is what we need is a permanent and binding solidarity mechanism for intra-European reception, and so with a fair distribution key. And so that's part of the whole upward harmonization of asylum and migration policies that we need in the European Union nowadays, because what we now see is a race to the bottom, and that's what, of course, we have to counter, and we cannot accept that some member states opt out of the whole asylum acquis and say that we do not want to welcome any asylum seekers in our country. So this is something that we have to resist, and so we need a binding solidarity mechanism. And then a final point, when it comes to the human rights at the borders and the pushbacks, we need better human rights monitoring. And it should be effective and independent monitoring mechanism. That's what we put on the table, and that's maybe one of the few highlights, I think, in the Pect's proposals, is that the Commission proposed to have this monitoring mechanism, independent monitoring mechanism, put in place in the screening procedure. So this is a positive element in the proposals, and so that's what we also in Belgium, we ask the Belgian government, of course, to defend this, to keep this in the Pact proposals. But in our eyes, we think it should be a lot broader than what is proposed now. It should not be limited to the screening procedure. It should be broader in scope, but also we need more guarantees that this mechanism can function independently from the national governments where it will be active. And then one more point linked to the point of human rights violations at the borders. The Frontex agency, we think we need a radical reform of the Frontex agency so that really human rights are at the center of this organization. And what we have seen now in the latest years that they turn a blind eye on violations, and so we really need a reorientation of this agency. So these are the main recommendations that we put forward in all our political work around the Pact. So if you want to have a deeper look in this as well, I can only recommend the new report of our colleagues of CNCD 1111 that is on the website of CNCD, where you can read also a lot more on the concrete proposals. And so I think it's also important that we mobilize around this alternative discourse and these recommendations, so that we show also to decision makers that there is a civil society that is offering also a different narrative. So I will leave it there for the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Floor. I can only repeat your last words. So don't hesitate to inform yourself, and don't hesitate to visit the site. Of course, if you are well documented, you will be able to act accordingly. And it is important to challenge that pact. I will now give the floor to Charles Heller, who is president of Migreurop. He is also a researcher, and he's worked with geographical tools to try to work on the different wrecks that happened in the sea, and he has also different roles that would be very interesting. But today he will tell us about revendication and a priority dossier, which is Migreurop and the freedom of movement. That will be the topic of his speak today. Thank you very much, Cécile. Thank you to all the organizers and all the panelists. I'm very happy to be with you today for this webinar that is very important. The Pact can appear like a tsunami of papers, a huge document that is quite abstract, but in fact, the pact is producing its first effects. It is a pact between EU states against migrants that promises the Europeanization of the worst. So it is essential, as the SNCD is saying, to affirm that there is nothing inevitable about the policy about exclusion and denial of rights that are in the pact, and alternatives exist. And I think it is essential to work together and challenge the pact, and we need to make the most of this contestation to offer alternatives. So today I represent Migreurop, a network that is bringing together researchers from North and South and several forms of associations. And I'm very proud to speak in the name of Migreurop. And there are many speakers today who are part of our network. I am proud to talk about Migreurop because Migreurop has tidily denounced the EU's discriminatory and securitarian policies, and has been, for me and for many others, a political compass to understand the stakes of the political evolution in progress. I am proud also because I speak in the name of migrants through the alliance between associations from the North and the South that is proposing alternatives to that Europe, and the network is in favor of freedom of movement and settlement as the main alternative to the EU policies for several years. I will put in the chat for all of you a short video that was produced recently by Migreurop about freedom of movement. And I can also tell you now that the members of Migreurop are working effortlessly to the finalization of a critical atlas on the critique of freedom of movement. And we hope it will be a very useful and essential tool for those who fight for the rights of migrants. Migreurop has the pact. Freedom of movement should be central in any proposal, and it should be presented as a new beginning for migration in Europe. This is what the Commission was promising when they presented the pact. And I think it should be not a pact against migrants, and which is the case today, but a pact with migrants. A pact with migrants, and at the heart of that pact, the freedom of movement and settlement. And it will offer every migrant safe and legal routes to access and stay in Europe. One consequence would mean that migrants would not need to use smugglers. They would not put their lives at risk. Because it will be controlled by legal means, migration would be seen as a normal process. We would remove Frontex. This agency, Frontex, would have its action limited, and they would work for Europe instead of being a risk for vulnerable population. The legal status for migrants would mean that they have a clear system for asylum that will still exist for those who need, but it will not be used as a tool for screening people to sort the good and bad migrants. I think that freedom of movement and settlement is a key measure in any migration policies and an alternative that would put an end to the conflict and the tensions that we have at the moment and the violence and violations that we witness at the moment. I think, and I agree with CNCD, and to fighting for migration justice, but freedom of movement should be seen at a larger scale in terms of rebalancing the relationships between North and South with the political and economical practices of the European Union that contributes to the conditions that are forcing people to leave their countries. It's not only about talking about the deep root of migrations that would be only considered as an issue that needs to be solved, but also we need to tackle the deep reasons of racism in Europe. We have today a conflict of mobility that opposes movements of migrants in the South to restrictive policies of European states. And if we only talk about migrants and if we consider migration as a problem, we completely forget the other side, the European state and their restrictive policies that are based on racism and discrimination. I will stop here because I think we're all tired after that long webinar, so I will be brief. But this is some of the directions that we are exploring within Migreurop, and some of those directions that I've just shared with you are elaborated and made with a colleague of Migreurop, Bernd Gaspara. And I would like to conclude by saying that contesting the orientation of the pact, we need also offer alternatives. And we have to say that contesting the pact is an opportunity for civil society who is defending migrants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. You've enabled us to actually catch up a bit on our time as well. So thank you very much. Thanks for your ideas. Before we go to our question and answer session, I'm going to pass the floor directly to Georgia from ARCI, just so that all participants can hear her closing comments and proposals. We'll then have some opportunities to actually ask questions, etc. So I'm just going to hand over to Georgia first. She's got a few proposals to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecile. Thank you for the floor. I'm going to speak in English, so I also thank the interpreters for your work. Thanks to NCD, all the organizations that and participants who are contributing to the success of this very rich event, and for inviting us from ARCI. As it was mentioned by Cecile in advance, ARCI, together with CNDC and the association organizing today's event, we would like to follow up today's session with some concrete steps to work on the proposals that came out from today's session, and to do it in concert between European and African civil society organizations and individuals who are committed in fighting the criminal effects of externalization and closure policies. We believe that a joint mobilization is urgent, and the urgency is quite evident thanks to the contributors to today's speakers. So I will just try to underline a few points that emerged today, starting from the fact that the political goal and the legislative proposal of the pact in a way has the objective to legitimize a situation that is already reality in Europe, that is already in practice, and that in any case still has the goal to emphasize the externalization approach and the strengthening of the external borders. So the effect of this approach were described thoroughly, and the measures proposed, if not modified, I mean in the pact, will worsen a system that is already discriminatory to people's fundamental rights at EU external border, internal borders, and in the transit routes, is deceitful with respect to the solidarity principle that should animate the common asylum and migration policy, and not only is not going toward a solidarity principle, a real solidarity principle, but is also ineffective in the perspective of achieving a fair, rate-based and sustainable asylum and migration system, firstly for the so-called EU country of first entries. So, and in final, as our colleagues from the Sahel and the Maghreb made very clear, it is the measure and the proposal are unclear and unjust toward the partnership with African countries and African population, a cooperation that in the past year has been mainly based on conditionality principle rather than on a fair and equal partnership. So in the context described, and I'm not going to take any more time on this because it was already a very rich panel and I'm very grateful for it. Many organizations and networks since the presentation of the Pact in September 2020 have managed to analyze and to elaborate alternatives to try to counter the risk of the provision contained in those proposals, with analysis, with research, with advocacy activities, with mobilization, and with the formulation of concrete proposals, a commitment that has lastly found space today and in the proposal elaborated by our colleagues from CNCD and ONS. We also tried to use any moment of exchange among civil society organizations and institutions to address the issues and the limit of the current national and European policy. The Festival Sabir is an international festival of Mediterranean culture that has taken place in Italy since 2014, and in the years has provided this opportunity. And in the last edition of October 2021, ARCI, together with our partners, our Italian partners, and with EuromedRights, have brought the discussion around the Pact in a final international assembly, where Italian, international civil society organizations, and European and Mediterranean networks, along with the institutional representative, have discussed the state of negotiation and have shared their experiences and their work. So what we are trying to do now is to propose to coordinate our effort and to try to engage in a joint mobilization to influence the content and the ratio behind the Pact. We believe that those objectives should be to maintain the dialogue and the collaboration with African and European civil society organizations, and that this webinar has the great merit of bringing together over this topic. We also would like to continue the discourse that has been enriched today and to ensure that as civil society organization, we bring forward proposals for concrete and fair alternatives. And I was seeing also that the debate is already started in the chat here in Zoom. So this is a great start. And we also believe that these steps will have to continue in a double direction. So first, the dissemination and activation at national level to try to influence and have a debate with our national governments, and at the same time coordinating and supporting our respective demands at European level and across the Mediterranean, so with our African partners. In this sense, we want to propose 2 meetings in March and April, an internal operational meeting with the aim of coordinating the initiatives, organizing joint mobilization and common strategy to advocate for the mobilization, for the modification of the proposal in discussion under the Pact, and in general, the European policy on migration, European approach on migration management. And we also propose to bring in the discussion again in the next edition of the Sabir Festival that will be held in the southern city of Matera in May 2022. And especially, we hope to promote a joint organization of an international programs that would give space for the formulation of these collective demands for immediate, fair, and viable alternatives to the current policies. Alternative that, as it was said by my colleagues, should reflect the principle of migration justice, freedom of movement, and human rights respect. So just to conclude, I'm not taking any more time and moving to a more operational plan. We will gather the interest of those who are interested to take part in the path, and we might follow up by proposing some dates for this meeting in the next week. And of course, we will be happy to welcome any suggestion or proposal. So I hope I didn't take too much time. I'm sorry if I spoke too fast for the interpreters, and thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Georgia.
Thank you very much, George. I think you've really tried to talk about our overall approach. As Maria said, the idea is to really take into account all the possible interventions and individuals that could be involved, look at all the important elements based on data, based on the ideas that came up during our meeting today, the political positioning involved, and the idea of really putting forward solutions and reflections to make some progress here. We are not going to actually express conclusions here today at the end of this webinar, because the idea is to really have food for thought and to continue our reflections. So I think luckily we've been able to catch up a little bit on our time. We really do apologise for the technical difficulties we had at the beginning with this webinar, but I think we've got some time now just for a few questions and answers. I know that some participants and panelists did have to leave, but I think it would be nice just to have a little bit of time now to look at the questions you wrote in the chat. Our colleague has tried to just kind of pull these and put them together. We had 2 or 3 questions, particularly surrounding the pushbacks between Algeria and Nigeria, for example, and so we wanted to ask that question specifically. So it's impossible to understand how countries like Algeria could be targeted for this. This was a question that came in the chat, and there was also questions for Marie about information on the strategy, particularly when it comes to police controls and police violence against migrants. So what can we say in terms of perhaps commemoration actions taking place surrounding specific violations? We've also got some requests for extra information from Mrs. Jimenez with regard to the Ceuta situation. So I'm just trying to pull some of these questions from the chat. I might just allow our specific speakers on Algeria and Ceuta to take the floor. Perhaps Mr. Shehu to begin with regard to the Algerian situation. Yes, thank you very much, Cécile. Thanks for the various questions that have come in. I'm just looking here with regard to the Algeria and Nigeria context. I would say that this idea of pushbacks is linked to quite a difficult situation with regards to the current president of Nigeria and some specific demands placed on the Algerian commissions and bodies. There was a specific need for cooperation on this issue that was identified, and it's true that the pushback aspect of this is very problematic. So we are looking at the issue here with the Nigerian and Algerian flows, and the fact that the border police was very much involved with the groups of migrants trying to actually cross the border, there was a series of expulsions that took place, and these were very much nationality based, so they were real deportations. We therefore need to look at the high levels of tension at play here, and the issue that this kind of context wasn't only applied with Nigeria and Algeria, but also other countries within the African context. So how can we look at this perhaps in the context of international texts, international conventions and human rights? There were what we call 0 points, where these individuals were actually sent back to, and then the individuals were actually forced to continue on foot to actually go back to their places of origin. So obviously this was a very problematic situation where people were in a very vulnerable position. I think it's important also to consider family reunification issues, because some children were separated from their families, from their parents during these deportations, and so this was obviously very problematic. There were also all kinds of violations committed, particularly when we look at vulnerable groups of women who were really in a very difficult situation within this context. So it's important to really evaluate what did go on and to look at this in the context of human rights, and we are looking at more than 25,000 individuals. So it is very critical in terms of one of the examples we can use of a failure of this kind of policy. There's also a new wave of asylum claims now that are being identified within this zone, particularly linked to Niger. So we need to monitor the situation. We need to see what's happening with new arrivals. And we can see that there's a growing number of individuals now looking at the current situation. We need to look at how voluntary returns are being organised as well within this area. What are the limits being set, and how are these voluntary returns being facilitated? This is a bit of a new situation in a way, so we need to see what's going to occur and how we can actually look at the particular issues surrounding this specific country context. Thank you very much. I'll maybe now allow the other panelists to take over. Thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Shehu. We've gone over time slightly. We're going to allow our interpreters, therefore, to leave us because unfortunately they have other commitments. So we're going to actually have to suspend the interpreting function, but we might just carry on together for another 15 minutes or so, just using our our floor channel. So I'll ask Maria to maybe just answer the questions specifically put forward in the chat for her, and then we'll talk a little bit about strategies for the future. Thank you very much, and goodbye from the interpreters.
Le webinaire est enregistré, le lien vous sera envoyé par email. Vous aurez normalement l'enregistrement en français et en anglais. Et n'hésitez pas, en tout cas, à aller sur la page des différents sites Internet pour avoir plus d'informations. Et n'hésitez pas également à prendre contact avec ARCI pour tout ce qui est mobilisation et action de suivi. Moi, je vous dis déjà à bientôt. Maria, tu as pour la dernière fois la parole.
Alors, si j'ai bien compris, la question c'est à propos de la marche pour la dignité. D'accord. Je vais bien essayer de répondre en français, même si je ne me sens pas trop à l'aise. Mais bon, de cette manière, les interprètes peuvent finir son travail. Donc, la marche pour la dignité, on l'organise depuis l'année 2014. C'est l'année où, quand la tragédie de Tarhal a eu lieu. Et on fait la marche pour la dignité chaque 6 février. L'année dernière, on a dû l'organiser en ligne à cause de la pandémie, mais cette année, on l'a repris. Et maintenant, je vais écrire sur les chats une adresse email où vous pouvez nous écrire parce que nous avons créé un dossier avec toutes les informations en espagnol et on a traduit aussi l'information à propos de la marche pour la dignité en français. De même, nous avons des réseaux sociaux où vous trouvez toute l'information. Mais bref, la marche pour la dignité se compose de 2 parties. La première, c'est une table ronde les matins où nous invitons des personnes qui vont parler à propos de derniers événements, à propos de la migration pendant les dernières années. Et nous proposons des alternatives pour les politiques migratoires actuelles pour que des tragédies comme celle du Tarhal ne se répètent pas. Et le soir, c'est la marche, c'est la manifestation qui va de l'endroit où la table ronde a eu lieu jusqu'à la plage du Tarhal. Là-bas, on va lire un manifeste et on va se souvenir de toutes ces personnes qui sont mortes, pas seulement le 6 février 2014, mais aussi toutes les victimes de politiques migratoires européennes. Et bon, je crois que ça, c'est un petit résumé de quoi il s'agit, mais je vais écrire sur les chats l'adresse que je viens de dire. Merci.
Et peut-être juste un mot sur la manière, si tu as encore le temps, 2 minutes, sur les fonds, la manière dont fonctionne Eline, parce que tu as dit que vous étiez complètement indépendants et pas du tout soutenus, en tout cas par des fonds gouvernementaux.
Alors, à l'association Eline, il n'y a pas de personnes qui travaillent, nous sommes des bénévoles. Il y a des personnes en tant qu'individuels qui, de temps en temps, font de petites donations. Je ne sais pas si ça se dit comme ça en français, mais des personnes qui, de manière individuelle, nous donnent un peu d'argent et c'est comme ça qu'on fait les activités. Mais on ne reçoit pas de l'argent du gouvernement ou des partis politiques parce que c'est la seule manière d'être complètement indépendant au niveau idéologique. Et ce qu'on fait vraiment, ce n'est pas des choses pour ce qu'on ait besoin d'argent. On donne des cours d'espagnol et pour ça, on a besoin que des personnes qui parlent l'espagnol et qui ont la volonté de faire que le reste apprendre pour organiser des activités à l'université. Par exemple, on a les ressources de l'université et pour la marche, c'est grâce à tous les collectifs et l'association qui participent qu'on a les moyens de l'organiser chaque année.